Chapter 51 Adrift in Fog Final. The abomination replied with a shriek of its own, using all three of its heads, which carried with it different tones and pitch. It was like the dying cries of a crow played in reverse. Strange and nauseating. The abomination was massive, almost the size of a fully grown male elephant. The multicolored hair waving in the breeze made it appear larger and ferocious. Its tail was devoid of any hair but was segmented like a rattlesnake, and tiny 3-inch spikes liberally coated the tail. Rowan observed that the tail could be a potent weapon, but compared to the size of the abomination, it was too small to effectively attack with. The physiology of these creatures just kept getting weirder. Nevertheless, Rowan did not let down his guard. This was an apex predator. No features on its body were wasted. But that did not stop a thrill of excitement coursing down his spine. The abomination charged at him, and Rowan lined up the beak like a spear to face the charging creature, and he properly set his feet to brace for the incoming clash. He shot a burst of his spatial sight to run a quick analysis, and he traced every movement of the creature. Selecting his target, he gritted his teeth, leaned forward and set his shoulders with bone-crushing speed. They both collided. Boom! Rowan was thrown backwards, and his body embedded into the pillar. Rowan blanked out for a moment and came to in a fraction of a second. He pushed himself away from the pillar. The slight force he exerted broke the battered pillars in two. The abomination had also been thrown back, its massive body tumbling twice, and throwing dust everywhere. The spot where they clashed had lines of impacts radiating from there. He moved to the left, dodging the falling beam. The gates it held came crashing down with a loud bang, and he winced a bit at the sound. The greedy gremlin inside Rowan complained about property damages and the cost of repairs. Pushing that little Scrooge aside, he focused on the abomination that was wailing ahead. The entire beak had penetrated its central head, so deeply its ends shot out from the neck. The shock of such a massive injury had killed a couple of souls inside the creature. Knowing he did not need to make this gesture but still doing it just for dramatic effect, Rowan snapped his fingers and the wails from the abomination ceased, and it collapsed. The wave of soul energy that streamed into him made him smile with satisfaction. Soul Caesar shrank and returned to his wrist, eerily fading through his shell and latching onto his flesh. Rowan brushed away specks of dust from his shoulder and surveyed his garden. It was a mess. Craters and broken trees littered the grounds. The short fight with the avian abomination had destroyed his once pristine gardens. Even his gates were no longer standing. Luckily, the sigils placed on the gates were drawn on a rare metallic ore that was difficult to damage. They were still functioning properly, he could tell because the fog had not come closer to the gate. The sigils were drawn on hexagonal metallic plates that came in sets of 7. The character seemed simple at a glance, but a more careful introspection of the plates would reveal a somewhat 3D-like effects on the drawn lines. They shifted in angles that defied meaning. It was a fool's errand to try to copy a sigil. The way the lines were drawn, you could not even trace its starting point. Little was known about these bizarre symbols before a reluctant explanation was released to the few noble clans. Sigils were a set of lost languages of power that could only be drawn by the Melchine forges of the God King. They were rare and precious, and one of the hallmarks of nobility was to have access to it. It could not be bought or traded, and it was strictly defensive in nature. There were rumors of sigils with different capabilities, housing both offensive and support capabilities, exists. If there was, the God King kept that knowledge and their existence under wraps. What made sigils a powerful tool, was that they did not need any apparent source of power to function. They could exist perpetually unless they were destroyed, and that was very hard to do. Almost impossible. Rowan had never heard or read of anywhere where sigils were destroyed. They were always recovered in the event of the owner's passing. The plates could be tracked, and this dissuaded the most hardened thief. After countless examples of entire families and even counties being wiped out for stealing a sigil plate, Rowan heard the rapid footsteps of Maeve and the guardsmen. They were just making it to him. The battle was a short one. My lord, we followed your battle from a distance. Apologies for my failure in guarding you. Forget it. There was nothing you could have done, and I am also complicit in this matter. Rowan interrupted her. Besides, it was a short battle. Your efforts should be placed elsewhere. These attacks show we are not safe here as our defense are solely lacking. A few more of these things, and everyone here would perish. Creating ambush points is ineffective, if they can just fly over them. With the tools we have, there are limited countermeasures to this problem. Maeve seemed to have developed new frown lines. The guardsmen, meanwhile, were assessing the creature, poking at it. Captain Titus looked at the abomination while frowning, This was not the first time he had seen the eerie method with which Lord Rowan was able to use to kill these creatures. He knew that a wound like that should not be able to kill them. He kept that thought to himself, however, and motioned for his men to check their surroundings for any breach caused by the battle. This mayhem around him showed that this battle was at the peak of legendary, and if he was unsettled about how a helpless noble could become so powerful in such a short time, he showed no indication. Rowan's sight was wrapped around him. Checking his reactions to these events, his sketch reveals there was something problematic about this individual, and he hoped his vigilance would bear fruit. He had figured out some of his capabilities, and he would need to leave for the moment. The appearance of the avian abomination indicated that even if he stayed behind, there was no assurance he would be able to save his people with his current strength. Although he was powerful, his offensive methods were still not complete, particularly his range offense, and getting to legendary would most likely for him be killing two birds with one stone. He would be enhancing his lifespan, as well as grow more powerful, and get his legendary ability. A unique power that could only be bestowed on a dominator when he became a legend. Rowan turned and began walking back to the manor, calling for Maeve. So as I was saying, Rowan suddenly stopped talking and looked at his feet. The dust was stirring rhythmically. It didn't require much thought to figure out this was the pattern of breathing. This could only come from a set of massive lungs, and the only creature that should be able to do that, should be dead. He turned to see the abomination risen once more. The head he pierced was the one in the middle, that one laid dead, the movement of the abomination dragging it to and fro. It suddenly spread great leathery wings and its two heads rose and shrieked to the skies. Chapter 52 Memories of the Fallen. The guardsmen zoomed past Rowan. Their actions were swift and precise. They drew their swords and attacked. There was no hesitation and their cooperation was flawless. With Captain Titus leading the foray. Like a pack of wolves circling their prey, they attacked the abomination from all sides. Their blades left deep wounds all over the abomination. Its angered shrieks were deafening. Rowan knew this was not enough to stop the abomination. If it was not delivered a fatal wound by beheading, they would have to be cut into small chunks, for these creatures have a tenacious vigor. Rowan saw the previous wounds they had dealt it, closed up and stopped bleeding. The abomination was getting used to their abilities and patterns of attack, for they did not really threaten its life. It suddenly lunged forward and swatted away one of the guardsmen with its spiked tail, who did not anticipate this move from the abomination. The guardsman grunted as his body flew towards the fog. Sparks flew from the armor, it was nearly torn in two. The guardsman was lucky, for the tail barely missed cutting through the armor, and he would have been lost to the fog, for the blow was powerful enough to fling him outside, and if not for the quick tackle of Rowan, who intercepted him in midair. Draw its attention away, do not bother with killing it. Lord Rowan would deliver the finishing blow. Maeve called out, and from that mystical spot she kept everything. She fished out the great axe from midair. Her brows were instantly dotted with sweat as her aura plunged. The axe gave out a shrill drone that made her teeth ache. It was clearly annoyed at her for using her ability on it, but what the axe craved was battle, and so it permitted this shift. With sheer will, she tossed the axe to Rowan and collapsed to her knees. She had never felt such a ravenous hunger from anything before. If she held that axe for a few minutes, it would surely kill her. Rowan's single eye lit up when he saw the axe. The axe was supposed to be extremely light for a dominator like Maeve. Nevertheless, it seemed to weigh a ton, plus its vitality-draining effects made her throw lackluster. She missed the throw, and it was going to fall short, far from Rowan's reaching hand. But all these were meaningless because as Rowan opened his hand, the axe that should hit the floor veered towards his palm. A low keening sound of excitement came from the axe. Rowan rewarded its commitment by pouring considerable loads of vitality into the axe. It shivered and began to emanate a golden light from the axe head. He gave it more and the axe head blazed with a golden flame. Rowan eyed the abomination. If one head were not enough, he would cut down all three. The axe agreed, and seemed to fit in Rowan's palm better. Rowan carefully circled the abomination. The next series of action happened fast and left Rowan in awe, reminding Rowan why the guardsmen were the shock troops of his family. The captain ran up a raised patch of earth that resulted from the earlier battle with the abomination. He shunned gravity as he leapt forward. Twirling his sword, he cut through a section of the thick neck of the creature. The blow pushed the head of the creature backwards only to be met by another guardsman who struck at the same wound deeply from the opposite direction. Only the thick spine of the abomination stopped the head from coming off. The abomination cried out, and its head began to slump down, clearly stunned. It was not over yet. As the captain fell, the last guardsman was on his knees locking his hands together. He caught him, and with a yell, he heaved upwards towards the falling head. the captain delivered the last blow and the head rolled down. The eyes on the head showing anger. The legs on the abomination buckled and it fell. Now you guys are just showing off. But by all the gods. There were 1,000,000 more of such guardsmen in his family. Rowan was now realizing how much power his family, and the rest of the nobility as a whole, controlled. After all, they were all descendants of gods. Sometimes he forgot that. Not one to miss an opportunity, he beelined towards the last head that was snapping and hissing at the circling guardsmen. Hearing his footsteps, it shrieked at him and the axe answered it. Rowan had never used the axe to cut something before, only calling on its inherent ability to create multiple phantasmal duplicates of itself. The axe added momentum to Rowan's swing. This meant that he would hardly use any effort when he wielded the axe. The sharpness surprised him and he used too much strength. Rowan was aiming to cut into the skull. That was all he needed for Soul Caesar to work, but the axe went through the head like it was an illusion. The yellow blood pumping out, however, was not. Turning to the last head that the guardsman had cut, Rowan was not going to be surprised again, as he saw that a new head was growing from the neck the guardsman had cut. He held the axe over the last regenerating head. It was nearly complete, and the shape was different. Rowan, feeling a bit of spite, waited for the eyes of the abomination to open. When it did, it was not disoriented. Its new head resembled a human's face, with teeth poking through the face, its yellow eyes fixed on Rowan's, and the abomination suddenly reared up, only for its head to fall moments later. Rowan's hands were still. The axe was that sharp. When the abomination rose, its neck passed through the axe Rowan held up. He even suspected that it did not feel a thing. The two waves of soul power that flowed into him confirmed his suspicion of this creature being a sort of Frankenstein monster. Multiple abomination had been merged, but their life force was kept separated. The reason for the 3 heads was not because he was fighting against a single abomination but 3. He did not know if these tactics were frequently used by abominations before or if this was a clear reply to his abilities. It was all bad news to him. Rowan knew this had to be a blatant reply to his abilities. Apparently the abomination core must be aware of the ease in which he slaughtered abominations, seemingly disregarding their perverse vitality and, most likely, this was an experiment to understand how it works. This reminded Rowan again that he was not dealing with a mindless drone, but a core. An alien intelligence that could change strategies and learn from its mistakes. A thought occurred to Rowan, and like a madman he began hacking the abomination apart. Each of the swings cutting out massive chunks of flesh. With the axe he could use one of the berserker skills he had. Smash. Smash. Berserker jumps to the target, and smashes their axe into the opponent. Also using combo attack alongside it, he tore the abomination apart. When the upper part of the body was all but destroyed, he felt a frightening wave of soul power flood into him. Quote. It was 5 times denser than what he received from each of the heads. There must have been another abomination hidden inside. The idea that occurred to Rowan was that if this was an analytical foe, it would attempt to keep its capabilities hidden. If it could separate the life force of the abomination into 3 parts, why not 4, or even 5? If he had not been careful, he may have died in an ambush he did not see coming. Chapter 53 Memories of the Fallen 2. Rowan felt a headache coming on. The arriving battles were going to be harder as he could no longer one-shot these creatures. Thankfully, he had a great weapon, and he knew his growing abilities would still make all these concerns meaningless soon enough. Speaking about weapons, what happened to his shears? It occurred to him that he may have lost it during the chaos of the battle, and he had totally forgotten about it. I really need a skill on weapons care. Can't go around losing my weapon and leaving them behind in a field of battle. Rowan knew it was not his fault. He did not grow up fighting battles. The only reason he was not a gibbering mess was because, in a manner, he was numb. He had experienced too much in so little time, and he knew he needed a lot of quiet time to go through his garbage and work things out with himself. The battle waits for no one. Rowan would forge on, until he succeeds, or he dies. Let's return to the manor. The compounds are not safe any longer. Rowan said. He recalled something and his eyes flashed. He turned to Maeve. Walk with me. When they were out of the earshot of the guardsmen, Rowan said, thanks for the save. Maeve cocked her head and her eyes lit up in understanding. It's my duty. My lord. Yeah, about that. Can you stop calling me that? You should call me by my name. Maeve smiled. I dare not. This is how it has always been. Your status deserves every acknowledgement. I do not care so much about my status. Our relationship should have gone beyond the need to be separated by titles and whatnot. I understand, master. This goes beyond you and me. The nobility would have my head if word gets to them that I stepped beyond my station. Nobles. Rowan scoffed. I see no nobles here in my time of need. I only see you and your effort. Rowan paused. I want us to be friends. If I am going to die in this coming battle, I would rather it be beside a friend, not my servant. Maeve was speechless. My lord, master, I can't. I am sorry, but there are rules I cannot break. Oh, if that is the case. Rowan's voice became forlorn. Maeve hurriedly interrupted him, her voice flustered, but I have always been your friend, my lord. That would not change, even though I serve out of loyalty. With the years, I have grown fond of you. If you are to fall in battle, master, your enemies must have stepped over both my broken body and my ghost. An uncomfortable pause grew between them. Before Rowan coughed, his eyes flashed a bit of confusion before he buried it. Maeve was clearly embarrassed, and he hurried to change the topic. So, how do you bring out tools and weapons from midair? I don't actually pull anything from midair, my lord. This is related to a unique ability of mine. Maeve made a hand gesture slowly, so Rowan could follow her movement. She simply uses her thumb to touch the tips of her middle finger once, and opened her hand, and a piece of cloth materialized over it. She let it fall and repeated the gesture, and the cloth vanished. That cloth was from the kitchen table inside the manor. My unique, legendary ability allows me to shift anything I have laid my eyes on, and I have touched within the last 2 weeks. As far as I know, distance is not a limit. Rowan was mute in astonishment. He swallowed and replied, that is an incredible ability, it uses should almost be endless. Spatial ability falls under the path of the giant that I walk on. But it is very rare to awaken it at such a low pathway. Maeve's breath in deeply and continued, when I awakened this ability, it almost killed me, my mind could not fathom the process by which it operates. Thankfully, it was an innate ability of my bloodline, and I did not really need to understand all the intricacies to make it work. Well, there are some restraints on the abilities, disregarding the 2 weeks I have to constantly see and touch the items I need to access. I cannot move items greater than what I can carry, and the more intricate or powerful the item, like the axe, the more strenuous it is for me to shift it. And finally, I cannot shift a living being. Rowan's head was lowered a little in deep thought. He knew about legendary abilities. To understand how it works, one must understand the pathway the Dominator treads. When a Dominator gets to the legendary state, the pathway he cultivates would unlock an ability from the bloodline, and this ability was significant because it was easier to identify your strengths using the ability you were able to receive from your bloodline. So, nobles of the same bloodline could unlock entirely different abilities at the legendary state. As far as Rowan could tell, there were 7 major pathways of dominion, all corresponding to the 7 major bloodlines. Through his studies and the knowledge that he could acquire, he got to know about 3 of the pathways. Even the names of the other 4 elude his grasp. The pathways he knew included Pathway of Storms. The Dominator on this pathway were known as Storm Callers. They controlled lightning and frost, and at higher pathway they could control the weather. Some Dominator in this pathway tend more to frost than lightning and vice versa. Though, at the height of their powers, they all would be able to control every ability under that pathway. Under a pathway, many Dominators usually switch into different sub-occupations that inclined more to their bloodline and talent. A Dominator under the Path of Storms could become a Frost Lord or a Lightning Weaver, an Ice Titan or a Magnetic Gren. The second pathway Rowan knew was the pathway of the Wanderer. The Dominator on this pathway controlled all major aspects of nature. They could be termed druids, and they branched into many branches like beast tamers or treants. The Kuranes family tread on this last pathway that he knew, which was the pathway of the Adept. According to family propaganda, this pathway was the most powerful of all the pathways, second only to the mysterious pathway of the God King. Dominators of this pathway had control over flames and the earth. They could draw down light from the sun or create a massive golem from the earth's core. They could raise the skies or flip the earth. Recently, Rowan was aware of a new pathway, which was Maeve, Pathway of the Giant. Though she admitted that she did not know whether this was the pathway itself or just one of the sub-occupations under the pathway, and she had no idea of her bloodline as that information was known only to his mother, who had raised Maeve as a child. Her background was still a mystery to him, and he knew for all her loyalty, there were things he could not get her to divulge to him. Pushing the pathways away from his mind for the moment, he focused on the most pressing problems. Their survival. He was going to the other world. He had calculated the time he had spent there and saw that there was no disparity in the flow of time between both worlds. If he spent 1 hour in that world, the same amount of time would pass in this one. He did not have to worry about missing major events while he strived to power up and break his lifespan curse. Chapter 54 Memories of the Fallen 3. Rowan had to go to his personal chambers in order to access the yellow gem enclosed inside his mansion. He gave Maeve strict instructions that he was not to be disturbed in the next hour. By his estimation, that was all he needed to collect enough soul points from that world. The area where the gem lied was inside his bathroom, and he easily tore through the walls until he reached the gemstone. He checked himself one more time, and squeezed the axe, hearing its comforting buzz. He had some disquietness about bringing this weapon with him, although it had granted him a valuable aspect. There were many suspicious points about this weapon. He thought about it for a while and still decided to bring the weapon along. It was his greatest weapon presently, and if it could save his life at a critical moment, it would be extremely foolish to leave it behind. His eyes took on a look of determination. He was not leaving this world unless he became a legend. Stretching forth his hand towards the glowing gem, another hand emerged from it and grabbed him. His enhanced agility stat had shown him that this hand was a direct replica of his own. He appeared inside that strange passage, and he walked towards the red glowing light. His hearts were calm and his trust in his skills was enough. He checked his primordial record and saw he had received a total of 174 soul points. He threw them all into Ouroboros, waiting for a couple of seconds for his body to grow adapted to his increased attributes, and then he let himself be drawn into that world. He saw himself lying on his back when he came to. Overhead was the red moon. He wondered if this world was always in perpetual night. He spread his spatial sight around him and immediately went tense. This place was different from where he had first arrived. He had arrived in a ruined city the first time, and now he was at a beach. Around him were massive piles of bones that covered the entire beach, and he found himself under them, and below him was the gleaming teleportation rune. He would have mistaken the bones for massive dead trees if he had not swept his sight around him. He heard the waves break on the shore and his sight penetrated the fields of bones, and he saw endless desolation. Even the ocean that he saw was red like blood, and he rapidly drew back his sight and placed it around him. He would not repeat what he did the last time and alert the inhabitants of this place. His spatial sight was only indeterminable by those weaker than him, and he suspected that he was among the weakest here. His sight entered the primordial record, and he sighed in bliss, as he saw he already had 50 soul points already, and it was growing as he watched. Instead of using his spatial sight, he intended to use his eyes. He had discovered early on that his energy sight could be switched on or off. If it were active, there would be a gleaming light in his eyes like lightning. He activated his energy sight, and he was nearly blinded, but in a short while, his eyesight adapted and he saw an astonishing new world. The first thing his senses brought to him was the smell. It was a stale, sulfury smell, with an addition of iron, which he surmised came from the literal ocean of blood. The next was the sounds. There were none. Except for the sounds of the waves breaking on the shore, yet he knew this was all a facade, for all around him there was life, an overwhelming amount of life in fact. The surrounding bones held energy like massive slumbering volcanoes. He did not have time to properly use his sight to check his surroundings, but that was a good thing because he was sure that the entirety of the bones on this beach belonged to a single being. The energy inside the bones ebbed and flowed in a manner that resembled breathing. At this time, Rowan was still on his back, and so he cast his gaze around him, and he was able to observe the repeating patterns of the surrounding bones. They were like tall pillars that pierced the earth and reached for the skies. The energy inside them was milky white, and by their curves, this series of bones appeared to be rib bones. He was inside the ribs of a gigantic creature, and whatever this creature was, it was not dead, or perhaps its body was not dead, even though its soul might already be gone. Using his body as a reference, while still in the mortal state, his body vitality was so rich, he knew even if his soul died, his body would not necessarily perish. How much more these beings who were on a height of power that he could not even ascertain. If gods could ever die, this place should be their graveyard. The sense of power that these bones gave was palpable. He thought about the massive amount of soul fragments in this world. Perhaps these were just the remnants of a powerful being long dead. Just the tiny portion of their souls could create so many soul points for him to harvest. Looking at the soul points gathered, it was already more than 400 and counting. He shuddered in excitement, and kept his eyes peeled for any approaching enemy, and he figured that he might be very lucky. Apparently there were many of these teleportations rune in this world, and that meant he might not know where he ended up. He could have easily appeared inside the nest of some powerful creature that was very active, and who might disperse his existence with a sneeze. In fact, He believed he was exactly in a place like that, but he was lucky that this being may have a high threshold for nuisance or because he was too weak. He wasn't seen as important, but the most likely option that Rowan went with was this being may be asleep. It was an instinct, which was brought about by the energy flow inside the bones. It was a bit mesmerizing to watch, and the steady cadence of its movement made him think of a sleeping child. The beach had been empty when he first swept his sight around him. The presence of such a powerful creature must have deterred all others from disturbing its slumber. If he was going to be a frequent visitor in this world, it would be a good thing if he could direct the spot of his descent. Well, some things were out of his hands. He proceeded to sit down cross-legged as his soul point had exceeded 800 points. It was so close now. He began a series of deep breaths. With the holes in his shell, he had no more trouble breathing, and he could focus on other things. The axe he held was mysteriously quiet, not even letting out a hum. The behavior of this axe was questionable. He felt it was most likely sentient, but he had no ways of communicating with it. He wanted to push his spirit into the axe as he had never attempted to do that before, but he pushed that thought aside. This was not the time for such experiments. It would be a great source of regret if he lost this stable manner he was gathering souls because of a whim. His soul point broke the 1,000-point threshold, and Rowan's fingers began to itch in anticipation. 55 memories of the fallen final. If not for the overwhelming sinister nature of this world, this place would be a great place to relax. There were no howling abominations and wailing mothers, no weeping children and sounds of weapons tearing through flesh, only the bloody waves breaking over the shore, and his soul points increasing at every turn. He felt a wave of tiredness over his soul. It has been a tough couple of days, hasn't it? At this time, he had spent only 10 minutes in this world, and he had gathered 1,000 points of souls. Seeing that his path to legendary and even beyond opening up for him, his mind went still, and his three hearts became calm. He allowed himself to fall into a state of near slumber, and he awoke every 10 minutes to check his soul point growth. When he gathered 3,000 points, he finally breathed easier, and went into a state of semi-slumber once more. When he gathered 7,000 soul points, his excitement was even not that much. It seemed like it was a normal state of affair. When he gathered 10,000 soul points, he was nearly asleep, until he had an intense pain inside his hearts. His consciousness seized, and like an electric jolt through his system he pushed his sight inward, and he came to a painful realization that he was dying. Rowan had made a fundamental mistake. When he saw his lifespan, he had judged he may still have a little time left. Surely he must have had a few weeks or months left to gather powers and take care of his affairs, but he was very wrong. He had been at the final moments of his life. When a mortal was at the edge of death, they could burn their vitality and push through the obstacles in their way, seemingly achieving great feats of strength and living far past their due time. If only for a moment. Rowan was wrong. The primordial keepers did not make a mistake when they attempted to kill him. And failed? No, they succeeded, for he was already dead, and he had no lifespan left. His record did not show him an exact number of days or weeks left because there was none. At that moment when Maeve had found him with a knife sticking through his eyes and into his brain, he had exhausted all his lifespan. What kept him on his last breath for so long was two things: his stubborn spirit and his inexhaustible vitality. His soul had only the barest wisp left, yet as he evolved the Ouroboros bloodline his vitality increased to a ridiculous amount, and that was what fanned the flames of that last dying wisp. He had so many problems on his mind. He had been torn in different directions, trying to understand. To fight his way out of this hell he woke up into, he had never relaxed for a single moment. But everything had an end. His growing soul point finally made him relax his spirit, and that last tenuous grasp on his soul slipped from his aching grasp. Like all selfless individuals, the soul of the prince had influenced Rowan far more than he knew, for instead of pursuing his survival at any cost, he placed the needs of the many over his own. The pain in his heart increased as the snakes were going crazy inside him. They were a part of him that in his mortal state he could not yet grasp. His hands seized his chest, and with his last will he attempted to push his soul point into Ouroboros. But he was so exhausted. He screamed and fought for his mind to move, as heavy darkness began to encroach over his sight. Move, damn it, move. I have everything I need to live, and I can't fail at the edge of winning, please. Not like this. Not like this. His hands collapsed by his side, and his breath ended. His soul slipped away from his body, and it began to ascend. Overhead, the skies of this world that had never seen the light of the sun changed. For the soul of an Empyrean was dying. The surrounding bones began to tremble, and overhead the skies parted, and a great eye, that seemed to contain all the darkness of the void, opened. Is this what true death feels like? It kinda peaceful. It's silent, and all my worries and toils seems so far away from me. I can drop all my burdens. I can truly be free. All of my pain and sorrow. The fears that haunts me, all my confusion, my doubts, all that I lack, all that has brought me shame, I can simply leave behind. I can stop the struggle. Death would be a blessing. I would have won, for what do I really have to live for? Playing catch up in another month's life. No, I may not remember the precise moment it happened, but this life became mine. I have lived my life. It was not a long one, but it was a rich one. This is good, this is proper. I can go to the darkness. But this was not of my choosing. The primordial keepers cut short my lifespan. They do not welcome my presence. Dying would be handing what is left of me to beings who would gladly torture me for an eternity, just because I have their bloodline. My father tore my body and mind apart repeatedly, for his own gain. I can still see the disdain in his eyes. Maeve, it was hard at first to see the signs. But I saw them. What sort of master would I be to leave you alone, in your torment? I do not know these people I got to protect, but I can still remember their lives. I still remember the pain and the horror of it. And I still remember my promise. I told them, I swore to them on my blood, that I would make them pay. Their enemies are mine also. They have treated us all like objects to be used and discarded, no more. Would I let this pass? If I die, it would be by my own choosing. I have earned that right. For I've died before, and I died a second time, and a third, and a fourth. How less than nully greater than man, less than nully greater than why times has my soul being tortured without my knowing, or say, this time it would be by my own choice. My dear father, keepers, do not count me out. The bracelet that encircled Rowan's wrist rose and expanded, and the jaws of Dagon opened forth. Rowan's soul was already halfway through the opening in the sky, where that great black eye watches, when the jaw seized his soul and dragged it down. The great eye above trembled and slowly began to dissipate. The reason it could stay in the material plane for so long was due to the nature of this place. The prize had not escaped its grasp, for it was a dying flame that could only shelter itself from the storm for a little while before it expired. The great eye reduced itself to a pinprick, and became a spot darker than night, and it waited for the shelter to crack open. Although it was patient as the endless void, it still fashioned a soul storm around the body of Rowan. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Rowan found himself in darkness. His thoughts were slow, as if his mind was filled with syrup. He felt so cold. If he had a body, he would have been shivering. There was one spot of light ahead of him. It was golden and felt like the sun, and he wanted to enter that light, but he was so tired, but he mentally pushed himself to move. Rowan's form was pitiful. If a soul was a burning flame, he was less than the smoke that escapes the fire. Yet the will inside that smoke was powerful. A lifetime of pain and loss had crafted that life force from coal into a diamond, and if all that was left of him was just a wisp of himself, he would never stop. Yet, his resolve was powerful, but he was wasted, and his grasp were losing their hold on his awareness. Even inside his jaws of Dagon, he could only last for a while. He was too weak and slow to enter that golden light. His body was before him, but at the speed he was moving towards it, he would inevitably fail. But that did not make him to stop his advancement. The wisp of his soul made that golden light its everything. His focus was total, and if he were to slip into death, his eyes would remain permanently fixed ahead of him. Nothing would hold him back, not death, least of all despair. If I am to die, it would be on my feet, striving for life. Let it not be said I failed my promise, while on my knees. He remembered crawling through the darkness in the mines, bones broken and his mind on the verge of shattering. He remembered it like it was yesterday. At that time his soul was far weaker than it was now. Yet he did not break. He remembered the madness of the spatial corridor, where he held himself on the verge of madness for what seemed like an eternity. His stubbornness to never give in to despair has always been his one character trait he had never let go off. After all, no one else would ever walk in his shoes, he was the master of his fate. He alone understood what he went through, for empathy only goes so far. His soul was getting weaker, the enhancement of his jaws of Dagon was weakening, for even as it held its soul over his body, a horrifying suction force was trying to pull that wisp away. At the last of his strength, he felt a growing warmth flowing inside his soul. It began as a trickle, and it slowly grew to become a flood that covered the wisp of his soul. It was like music that would make you cry. It was like being wrapped in a hot blanket after braving a storm. It was a lover's laughter. It was a mother's warm embrace, a father's smile that shows his pride in you. It was everything a mortal could experience, both good and bad. It was everything a person was and could be, and it was given freely to him. It was the soul of his people he had kept inside the jaws of Dagon. They came around him, and they poured their strength into his dying wisp. Rowan's soul was like a gray smoke, while their souls were like a shining lamp, and as they gave him their everything, they began to vanish. For even in his weakened state, his soul quality surpassed them all. Rowan tried to stop them, tried to say that it was not worth it. He was the Empyrean, he was the one who was supposed to save them. But a harsh slap resounded inside his soul, and he paused, stunned. Young man, we give ourselves freely, knowing you would protect our children, our mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers. Do not deny us this honor. Enjoy the chapter, guys. It beginning to heat up. Chapter 56 I Am Legend. Rowan was stunned by the selfless acts of these souls for his sake. Comparing the vigor of their souls with his, was like comparing a candle flame to a burning tree. Even though his soul was on its last wisp, it was still a soul with two omnipotent bloodlines, especially as one of the bloodline domain was of the soul itself. These souls were tiny flames. Grunmir, Voromir, Svegrim, Toranir, Gragver, Grarnir, Thogir. Question mark 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 ellipsis question mark 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 dot. What they were doing was futile. It should be impossible for them to affect his withered flames, yet. Alana, Morin, Branrick, Ragader, Fjarmir. They came and did the impossible. From the tiny flames they gave out, they reignited a forest. Question mark 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 comma question mark 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 dot. Each soul that touched his left him their goodwill. Young noble, thank you for saving my son. He is a little dumb, but he has a strong back and quick fingers. It is my honor to give you my flame. Kick their nasty behind. Sir, those demons are me in front of my children. Why did I never consummate my marriage after 3 months? Those bastards killed my Grigori. Kill them all. Take it easy. Young noble, Alana is cheering for you. Please live well, and Alana would be happy. Question mark 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 question mark. Ellipsis question mark 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 dot. Rowan's soul came ablaze with a glow that rivaled every color put on a canvas. He did not know what to feel at this time. It was a complex mixture of amazement and sadness. When he places these souls inside his jaws of Dagon, it occurred to him that as he was able to collect souls, why could he not collect his own like a lich? He had not been sure that he might succeed, but he was never one to lay down and die without fighting. He had asked himself, if he was in the final moment of his life, was it possible to extend that duration for as long as possible? Rowan had succeeded, yet he had also failed. He could safeguard his soul for a moment, but ultimately, his soul Caesar bloodline's jaw of Dagon was still too weak to harbor a soul like his own. His soul was unique, a merger of 2 different souls from 2 separated universes. It may never be possible to know how someone like him came to be, but he was. Already he could feel the surrounding strain. Only if he could place the jaws of Dagon inside his body, he might be able to start upgrading his bloodline. But a soul storm raged around his body, preventing him from descending, and more souls gave up their flames, and he burned brighter. His strength grew, as his unique soul became more. With a yell, he began forcing the jaws to push through the storm and enter his body. He strained and pushed with everything he had, but as he began inching closer to his body, the storm increased. Keepers. When he knew he could not move a single inch more, he stopped and watched the last soul flame enter his, and he gave his silent acknowledgement to these people who had given the ultimate sacrifice. The jaws could keep him safe, yet its speed was slow, and it was heavy. He scrutinized the soul storm around his body, it would tear him apart. He was too angry to care all that much, he had made promises, and he was too tired of failing them. Rowan pushed his blazing soul out of the jaws and into the storm. His soul was breaking, as his flames began to dim. The pain he experienced was horrendous, as everything that he was, became fragmented. But his soul was light and fast, and even as his flame died, he touched his body and gave a single order, before his soul collapsed into darkness. Asterisk 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 asterisk. The sylvan lakes were dark and empty. Every trace of life had been killed and devoured, nothing else existed in the lake except evil. The lifeless water was cold and surprisingly appeared to be very clean. Life held many things, chief among them being chaos. Life was messy and out of order. Things fail or break. Life dies and is renewed. Even in death, life thrives. The lake was empty of even death itself. Just filled with the cold and silence of emptiness. A silence that was broken by a thumping sound reminiscent of a new heartbeat. The sound echoed sporadically, and not in any particular order. At the bottom of the lake lied the head of a woman. From a distance, her features seemed perfect. But a careful observation would bring about some oddities. Because you could see the head lying at the bottom of the lake even when you were outside of it, and this observation was important because the lake was quite deep, and if this was not a trick of the light, then that would mean that the head must be gigantic. The face was blue with yellow stripes that ran all through, and her hair was black and flowing in the silent waters. Even in her gigantic size, her face was still beautiful, in a primal way. Nevertheless, the veneer of beauty was all from a distance. A closer look would reveal the horror beneath. The head lied on a field of bones, and it must have laid there for an inestimable amount of time, for there were multiple layers to this grotesque bed it rested upon. At the top layer were bones of humans and beasts of all shapes and sizes, and beneath were bones of giant that looked like rocks. Beneath were the bones of nobles in varying forms. Some bones of nobles were as tiny as ants, and some were as tall as mountains. Beneath the bones of the nobles were the bones of demons, and some of their remains could not be described, for their shape was too chaotic. And beneath all that rested a winged skeleton. The skeleton was inside a diamond-shaped crystal that served as a coffin. It held a great sword and was armored in gold. It was clear this was the first creature entombed here. Her individual strands of hair were as thick as pythons, almost 6 feet in diameter. Clustered within her hair were countless closed eyes. The eyes were all pierced with long spikes. Except for one eye, out of that eye crawled out a tiny tadpole-like creature that swam upward. It gingerly maneuvered through the dense locks of hair as it swam upward, until it became bigger, and it slowly morphed into a small infant with yellow eyes that glowed in the water. The moment the tiny creature broke the surface of the lake, another tadpole was spawned from the eye. The infant abomination swam towards the shore, where hundreds of bodies were placed. Most were dead, but interspersed in between the corpses were signs of some that were still breathing, moving. Strangely, these bodies were not from the town. Most of them were strangers that had no reason to even be close to this location. Some were Arthians that lived at the far edges of the continents, some were Belmanes, a seafaring people, and multiple other races. The bodies were surrounded by tens of giant abominations. The tiny infant creature crawled through the bodies and selected a body of a young woman, and with eyes gleaming with delight, it unhinged its jaws and began to swallow. A sound came like a crack of thunder, and a tiny glow shone on the surface of the lake, and 2 glowing figures stepped through from the light. The figures grew until they stood at a man's height. They both wore mysterious metallic armor with a strange mask that had a central piece resembling the trunk of an elephant. Chapter 57 I Am Legend 2. One of the armored figures spoke as they glanced at a ticking device. We don't have much time in this Nexus event. Check your readings and let's finish the mission promptly. Readings are all in the green. Good. How long do we have before contamination exceeds the minimum threshold? 2 minutes and counting. Proceed with descent and extraction. Like a flash of lightning, the figures pierced through the water and approached the sleeping abomination core. They reached the hair and proceeded until they stopped at a closed eye. Extract divine armament Tycho 27. Waiting for final approval. Proceed with extraction. The first armored figure took out a glowing blue slate. Pressing the center of the slate, a glowing hologram appeared. They resembled floating cubes. He moved them around until it formed a particular pattern and the surrounding environment blurred. For a moment and returned to normal. Shielding has been lifted for 12 seconds. Readings are normal across the board. No unexpected shift from parameters. Proceed with extraction. The second armored figure seized a spike that pierced a closed eye. This eye was directly beside the unsealed eye. And he began to slowly pull it out. This is so very wrong. He whispered to himself. Hurry, soldier. The contamination threshold would be reached in 52 seconds. With great effort, the weapon was pulled out. The spike wiggled around rapidly and soon turned red hot. The surrounding water evaporated into steam, and in a second it turned into ash. The closed eye shivered. It was awakening. Mission completed. Contamination threshold. 45 seconds. Excellent. Let's move out. As the 2 armored figures zoomed out of the water, one of them glanced below him and saw 2 wide open eyes glaring at them. They escaped from the water and proceeded to the glowing spot in the air. The first entered, and as the second was about to enter and leave, a thought made him look back into the lake. He saw eyes after eyes beginning to open, even with the ceiling spikes still piercing through them. The eyelids were torn in 2, but the eyes were still opening. He wanted to scream, but his training kicked in, and he counted the open eyes. He saw that 20 were already opened, and it still continued. He gasped in shock. His mind abuzz with horror and trepidation, he stepped into the light. The light vibrated and slowly faded away. The armored figure appeared underneath a glowing rune. Sparks of lights like fireflies rained all around him. He was anxious to report what he had seen when he smelled something off. His mind went into overdrive as he pulled off his helmet, as he could not see with it outside a Nexus zone. It was a slightly complicated affair, as the helmet was in 3 different layers, but he quickly began taking it off, a single layer at a time. As his heartbeat accelerated, he could properly smell what raised his feathers, and it was the familiar smell of blood. The last layer came off, and he saw 3 men surrounding the decapitated body of his squad mate. The one holding the blade was the general, Augustus, who turned to him as he carelessly tosses the head to the side. I hope you understand that in extremely sensitive cases, such as this one, we cannot let you live after you have completed the mission. The armored figure paused, his eyes tracing the head, as it left a trail of blood. The last look on his face was surprise and maybe fear. The man whose head rolled on the floor was his younger brother, and he was not supposed to take this mission. But this was supposed to be a relatively safe mission, even though everything about it was hush, hush. A mission from the big noble family would boost their career prospects, and open new doors of opportunities for them. He muscled his little brother to come along with him. He would share his good fortunes when they arrive, for this was the only family he had left in this world. Many thoughts ran through his head presently, but he steeled his nerves and nodded at the general. Understood, sir. He dropped the last piece of his helmet carefully beside him, making sure each of the components was in order. He was a great soldier, who understood that above all things was order. I am ready, General. General Augustus smiled and looked at the other two figures beside him, a smug look on his face. Turning back to the soldier, turn around and kneel. The armored figure proceeded to carry out the instructions, and the general slowly walked up to him, and placed a hand on his shoulder and said, if you have any family, they shall be well compensated, as stipulated by the statute. No, General. I have no more family. I am alone. Okay, soldier. I would be quick. Oh, by the way, do you have anything to report that was out of the ordinary inside the Nexus? No, General. The extraction proceeded as it was outlined. The second eye was unsealed with no interference. Quote, great news, soldier. It would be quick. Augustus Tiberius lied. It was not quick. He had noticed the flash of hatred in this soldier's eyes before. He hid it carefully. He slowly sawed the blade through the neck of the soldier. The soldier was a legendary dominator and had an impressive physique and healing ability. To his credit, the soldier did not scream. He only squeezed his hands tight as his head was slowly sawed away. You do know that he was lying to you. The figure inside the hood said. Get off your high pedestal, little shadow. The general frowned. Were you not the one who deemed this operation a failure, and requested to clean house? I know he hid something from me, but does it matter? The second seal is gone, and the board shall be reset. Leave the machinations of ants to ants. His secrets, whatever it might be, are meaningless. A loud laugh suddenly broke out. The third prince held his rotund stomach, and pointed to the hooded figure. Little shadow, the name fits, doesn't it? Be that as it may. The hooded figure huffed. It was a very careless error. Your bloodlust knows no bounds, and you just wanted an excuse to kill your men. And you wonder why I don't like you. General Augustus dismissed the hooded figure with a wave of his hand. Dying by my hand is a blessing to their pitiful lives. There are millions more just like that, and of all the uncountable ways they are going to die, to do so by my hands is an honor. He turned and picked up the two heads and began walking away. Inform me when this debacle is over. Also consider my partnership over if you make such impromptu decisions without a proper meeting first. In a short while, he transformed into a red line that broke through the clouds as he raced towards the horizon. How much longer before I get to kill that brute? The hooded figure growled. Well, judging by the heads he carried away, he is soon to know the truth. He is rash. Begin preparing the moon in the well. I will shield fate eyes. The third prince said, and he sighed. Let's get this debacle over with. The possibility of going to that place has made all else lose its meaning to me. The two remaining figures made some more plans as they soon hovered over the ground and pierced the sky. The area became silent and empty, except for the two bodies missing their heads. A short while later, the hooded figure reappeared and collected the two bodies and left. An hour after he left, the third prince appeared and looked at the scene bereft of any corpses. His eyes flashed red. It was impossible to know what he was thinking. He gave an enigmatic smile before he left. Chapter 58 I Am Legend 3. Augustus Tiberius. First of his name. General of the Red Legion of the North. The faithful sword of the God King, Golgoth, flew to the floating rune ship, Absamet. His hand held a decapitated head that had its eyes closed as if it were asleep. The cut around the neck was not clean. The blade must have been dull, for the wound was jagged, and the flesh almost looked torn apart. The rune ship Absamet was one of the 3 Herald-class warships of the Empire. It was 500 miles long and 300 across. It possesses an enlightened spirit that had grown with the Tiberius family and was responsible for directing troops at the forefront of battle. With the help of the enlightened spirit, Absamet was sentient. Absamet in its own right, was a weapon of absolute destruction. It could house 1,000,000 soldiers and all their additional machinery of war. Literally coated with living metal etched with sigils. Herald-class warships were almost indestructible. And unknown to Rowan, these warships were able to utilize offensive and support sigils. No one knew exactly when Absamet was created or how. Its makeup was shrouded in secrecy, and only the head of the Tiberius family had access to the enlightened spirit core. This year, Absamet was 33,000 years old. Even the head of the Tiberius family did not know when or how she was created. As powerful and old as he was, there were still secrets kept from him by his father, Tiberius. Every noble family descended from the bloodline of a god, and their surname was the names of each of the siblings of the god king. Kuranes, Tiberius, all were the brethren of the god king. After the Great War, the siblings made the most powerful dominator of their bloodline the head of their individual noble families, and as a boon, they were given permission to use the names of their primogenitor. So, each head of the family was called the name of their god. General Augustus floated in front of the massive battleship that covered an entire part of the horizon. Augustus always tried, but he still failed to stop the awe that covered his heart anytime he was close to this monstrosity. The massive rune ship was larger than many cities placed together, and its sheer destructive capabilities were spine-chilling. Absamet's primary duty was to stand watch at the edge of the Marauder continent of the north. It was designated as one of the 3 pillars who watched over the northern continent. Augustus, you slimy little Fouquet. I lend you my soldiers, and you return with his head. I told the old man to pour his seed on the Fouking ground when he was with that slut. But, no, he just had to have your inbred ass. The voice of a bubbly young girl sounded in Augustus' head. The voice of Absamet was no indication of its status as a monstrous ancient warship. The only indication that Augustus heard Absamet was a slight twitching of his left eyes. For anyone who knew the general, this level of restraint from him would be a very shocking surprise. The Tiberius family were known for their pettiness, and Augustus was among the best of them. He had raised an entire estate of a visiting diplomat to the ground just because the 6-month-old baby of the poor diplomat was constantly laughing every time Tiberius spoke. The poor diplomat was very pleased because it was the first time he had seen his cute new baby laugh so hard. He was a little worried because he knew of Augustus' pettiness, but he dismissed his fears when he realized it was just a baby. Besides, who slaps a smiling face? Augustus began by breaking the child's neck right in front of the horrified parents. Drawing his blade, he slaughtered everyone inside the estate. He had been in a superb mood that day. The diplomat had offered sizable bribes. But it was just in the way that the baby laughed, so pure and uninhibited, that set him off. Absamet, these men are under my command and I will utilize them the way I see fit. Augustus' voice had changed to a deeper growl. His patience was clearly running thin. Yeah, right. Spineless little sh*t, for the next 30 years, and you would be rotated for the next bastards to try their hands at warfare. But at least I can be assured that there would be nothing worse than you. Absamet was quiet for a while before she continued. The ancestor of that head you are holding was once one of my best soldier. I took that squealing babe from the ruins of Eloria, where the Great War ended. That baby had no right to be alive. He proved his excellence when he became a legendary from immortal. Within a short 2 decades. A damn blink of an eye. Without a single shred of old blood inside of him. I taught him how to fight. I taught him how to Fouquet. And he was magnificent. Augustus pressed his brows. An intense headache was building within. Absamet, let me in. Do you expect me to listen to his entire family history? You little sh*t, you would do well to listen. I have bred that line for 18,000 years. If I did not keep samples of their bloodlines, I would be back to zero. Your mindless buffoonery has cost me centuries. I would have to regrow a new batch from old stocks. Augustus' golden eyes deepened to a dull brown as he brought out a token. Let me in this instant. This is an order. Of course. E-levels are now open to you. All facilities are primed for your usage, General. A red light flashed, and General Augustus disappeared, but not before he heard Absamet murmur, the next 1,000 years family meeting, I am calling for a purge. Augustus appeared in a posh office space. Space would be the right word. This place appeared like an open field. E-level space were usually subject to spatial manipulations. The space was far larger inside than the outside would suggest. This level was meant for the elites and the direct line of descent of the Tiberius family. This office was a direct replica of his favorite office at his palatial manor. He made sure every single part of it was recreated faithfully. The place lacked any sense of style. Augustus did not have one. He simply picked all the expensive furniture and paintings he came across and gathered them here. An emperor-sized bed was placed at the center of the room, where 2 sleeping women in chains snuggled together. Lust briefly flashed across his eyes before he dismissed it and walked up to his armory. General Augustus frowned as he kept the token away. A necessary condition to be considered a candidate for the leader of the Tiberius family was to command Absamet without using the Orn token. He had 30 years left of his 100-year stay at the Herald-class warship, and he did not think he would succeed. He had made too many enemies and burned too many bridges that the only path to his survival in the future was one of ultimate power. The title of head of the Tiberius family seemed to recede from his grasp with every year that went by. So, he had to look for other bedfellows. He entered an alliance with a pair of risk-takers, and if they could succeed in their scheme, the path to ultimate power lied before them. A decrepit old man slept on the floor in front of his armory. He was sleeping and a line of drool escaped from his open mouth and ran across the floor. The old man was in a gray cloak that had seen better days, and his white hair was dirty and stringy. He muttered softly in his sleep, and he looked very vulnerable because of the way he was curled up and sleeping peacefully. Augustus harshly kicked him awake. Old demon, wake up. I need you to do a reading for me. Of course, General. The old man woke up and sleepily replied to Augustus. He stretched and gave a long yawn. Inside his mouth, his tongue was black and forked like a snake. Expanding the world, VER 1.0. Hi guys. I won't be doing this much often, because I feel it breaks the immersion in the story. Note. You don't need this info to understand the story. But since I would be dropping these names randomly throughout the story, it might help. Yeah, I know I should make a glossary. I'm working on it. Calendar. The eternal era of God King Golgoth. 12-month makes a year. I drew inspiration from a Scient Greece calendar. Truoplop. Hecaton. Metage. Romean. Pionop. Eulati. Mamek. Anthesterion. Elapheboli. Munichi. Thar Gelio. Skiraphorion. It is rumored that these were the names of the elder gods who created Trion. They were worshipped in a distant time, nothing of them remain but their names. It was said that in core of the planet, rested their bones. Filled circle chapter 60 I Am Legend 5. Rowan's body lay on a beach, in a world of death. Around his still form, an ephemeral storm rages, while an eye blacker than night watches in fury. Suddenly, his body twitched, his hand slapping the ground repeatedly, and then he began convulsing. The shell on his body began to quickly dissipate as multiple invisible mouths consumed it, and numerous bulges appeared underneath his skin, as if countless roaches roamed beneath. In a short while, every shell in his body was gone, and he lay naked on the beach, except for his twitching body. He was not breathing. His body began to grow hot, the surrounding air began to warp by the increasing heat. A mini vortex was created around him as a result of the extremely hot air being forced away from him. He began to grow. His increasing attributes were not just numbers on a status screen, they reflected on his physique, and with his Ouroboros bloodline, his body had begun a transformation that made his flesh comparable to divine metal. He grew to 7 feet tall and stopped growing. His body made metallic clunks as his muscles expanded and toughened. His skin got darker until it was a light shade of bronze, and every motion he made was like a blur to the naked eye. Slowly the activities in his body ceased, and yet, he did not breathe. Inside his body, a peculiar change was happening. Before Rowan's soul fell into slumber, he poured all his soul points into the Ouroboros bloodline, but this process was a continual one. Even if he wished to pour all 10,000 of his soul points into the Ouroboros bloodline, it would only funnel the soul points one at a time, although this process happened rapidly. As the Ouroboros bloodline grew, the snakes around his hearts were intensely stimulated and their growth increased exponentially. They gave out quiet hisses as they feasted on his shell, until there was nothing else, and they began to expand in size. Rowan had a conjecture previously about the nature of the size of the snakes in his heart, and if he were conscious at the moment he would have seen something amazing happening inside of him. Although the snakes were growing larger, the space they occupied remained the same. His body almost seemed like it contained an infinite amount of space around his heart, and no matter how big the snakes got, they would always be contained inside his chest. His bloodline growth was constant, as it slowly ticked upward, and then it hit the threshold of the legendary mark and paused. It was as if the last soul point encountered a barrier, and it could not push through, and it stayed that way, but a pressure was beginning to build. Rowan had dumped all his points into Ouroboros, and one way or another it was going to develop that bloodline. For a mortal to become a legendary state being, it would need to be thoroughly prepared, for it was about to elevate his entire being from the mundane to the mystical. There were specific rituals, and specific preparations to be made because it could be argued that this step was the most important to becoming powerful, for even though a proper mortal foundation was necessary, it was at the legendary state that the true wheat would be separated from the chaff. At the legendary state, the Dominator's body is now capable enough to access and contain ether, but they are unable to utilize it in an active manner, that is, until the Dominator ascends to the Rift state. The known state of change that Rowan knew were the mortal state, the legendary state, the rift state, and the incarnation state. Though there should be many other states of change higher than the incarnation state, he was not at the level to access such information. Nevertheless, from the legendary state, the Dominator could utilize ether only through their given ability, and from the rift state they could now wield ether. Ether is called many things. The life force of a world, the blood of gods, or the light of wisdom, but essentially ether was a force that only beings of legendary state and above could access. It could be found in all corners of the universe in different densities. Some parts of the universe had a stupendous amount of ether while others barely had none. Regions of the universe that had massive amounts of ether usually developed into a vibrant and powerful location, where gods, titans, beasts and elemental creatures could be born into. They were regions of great prosperity and also greater conflicts. When a Dominator crosses the cusp of legendary, their bodies are open to ether, and their bloodlines are nurtured to produce an ability it is inclined towards. This step was critical, for the first great divide of a powerful Dominator to a lesser one was at this point. Unique Dominators that were born at the legendary state or above typically had powerful legendary abilities that were closer to the roots of their bloodline. Those abilities had a high potential for growth, and could often determine the endpoint of a Dominator. A Dominator that had a passive ability of gathering and purifying ether would regularly grow to higher states of change than one whose ability was strengthening or fireballs. However, no ability was useless, and most times it depended on the ingenuity of the Dominator to find the best use for it. Every so often a powerful ability was not a good thing for the Dominator, for some were left with abilities that were too destructive, or others were too mystical, the user could not understand its usage and ended up harming themselves. There had been babies born at the legendary state who obtained abilities relating to spatial traversal. They found themselves locked in a unique region of space that only they could access. The only thing that was heard from them was their steadily weakening cries over the months before death took them. Few would survive such an ordeal, for the space they were in could not be rashly broken into, else it would collapse, and only luck could enable one to find them using a careful manner. Most likely, in a few years later, their bones would be spat out around the area of their birth. Rowan's case was different, for as an Empyrean, they were the children of the universe, and this gave them the right to have access to all their bloodline abilities, but at each state of change they could only select one that they could tolerate. You could learn and develop the abilities alongside the ones given to you when you reached the rift state, but that was very difficult, or get those abilities as you upgrade your state of change. At every state of change, a Dominator was given a chance to draw one ability from their bloodline origin. Unlike every other being who had to be lucky to have a powerful ability, an Empyrean just had to choose the direction it desired to develop towards, and if his bloodline could tolerate that level of power, it was then selected. Not all Empyrean are created equal, and some are vastly more powerful than others, but the weakest Empyrean was not something most creatures in the universe could stand against. For even the weakest Empyrean, at a minimum, could destroy entire solar systems with ease. Rowan was at the edge of legendary before he passed out, and unlike a normal form of unconsciousness, he was barely alive. The sacrifice of his people gave his soul a bit of light, but they were ultimately too weak to cause a fundamental change to his soul. Nevertheless, they gave him more time, and that was what he really needed. Chapter 61 I Am Legend 6. His bloodline trait was activated, and if he was conscious, right at this moment he should have found himself in an ocean of golden blood. The farther you went up the ocean was the level of power you would be able to draw from. The golden ocean of blood was extremely deep, it could be said that it had no depth. It was not possible to see a shore, for the ocean seemed endless. Rowan was unconscious, but the instruction he gave himself was not to be denied. He poured all his soul points into Ouroboros, and like being caught between an unstoppable force and an immovable object, his bloodline was being forced to grow, yet he was not awake to select the ability he was to ascend with. A storm began to build inside his body, as his soul points were held back by a single point, yet it continued to pile up the pressure. He began to cough blood as his body began to crack open, and although he healed extremely fast, his blood began to decorate the teleportation rune beneath him. It was a good thing his physique had grown to a terrifying state, else the destructive forces raging in his body would have reduced him to atoms. It was unknown if he would be able to survive a wound like that given his fragile soul. It appeared that he would soon be torn apart from the pressure, until something gave. His soul points could not enter his bloodline, but its aura was able to penetrate the mystical location, which was the source of the Empyrean bloodline. In that ocean of blood, an unknown aura that defied meaning but represented the height of potential in the multiverse swept through it. It resembled a formless force that could appear as diverse things to different individuals. It was the height of desire for any sentient and non-sentient species, and its presence on the material world was a temptation that none could withstand. Rowan only understood a fraction of the potential of his soul point, which could be seen as a good thing as well as a bad one. There was a reason the primordial keepers were not permitted to exist in the material multiverse. The golden ocean beneath that had been still for most of the time since the beginning of creation began to stir, and soon it began to tremble. This movement caused a great conflagration, and the surrounding space began to twist and was torn apart. This space was incredibly stable, and it would be impossible for most known forces to make it even tremble. Yet, the movement of the golden ocean twisted this space. Such display of power was shocking and represented the enormous powers that the golden ocean contained. The aura of the soul points was enough to stir this impressive power, and then a compromise was given. As Rowan was unable to choose an ability presently for him to ascend to the legendary state, an ability inside this entire ocean of blood was willing to bond with him was to rise and merge with him. Presently, only one legendary ability from the myriad of abilities would have to bond with him, an Empyrean with the light of creation at the tip of his fingers. For a long while, the ocean was like an agitated volcano, massive amounts of bloodline essence spewed thousands of feet into the air, and the skies were covered by thunderstorms that seemed to reach the end of existence. Inside the ocean, massive golden runes began to arise. The power they released was powerful enough to suppress an entire star. What was important was that this part of the bloodline ocean contained abilities only given to legendary Empyrean, and the bloodline runes that emerged were a unique ability of Empyrean. For a while, there was endless pandemonium in the bloodline ocean, before a loud call emerged from the depth of the ocean. The bloodline rune that emerged were massive, and their presence silenced a major part of the ocean. These runes had not seen the light of the surface for countless eras, and as they arose more of the ocean became silent, and there were 12 of them. They were all at a similar level of power. They gave out deep golden glows that seemed like a sort of communication pathway between them because there could only be one winner that could merge with this blood. The 12 bloodline runes released massive amounts of power to intimidate their peers, but they were at a standstill, as they all had similar levels of abilities. Their competition was stopped by a massive sound that shook the entire ocean of blood, even extending far past the legendary parts of the ocean, and 3 massive bloodline runes emerged from the ocean, giving out a palpable sense of antiquity as if they had existed at the beginning of creation. These runes seemed almost alive, and their level of power had far surpassed the legendary state and was giving out waves of power exceeding even the incarnation state. The 12 bloodline runes giving out golden light fled instantly and buried themselves inside the bloodline origin, and the skies above the golden ocean became clear and silent. The 3 runes began to arise, and they all seemed equal, and there was no confrontation between them. Clearly this 3 bloodline rune were willing to merge with Rowan. As they approached the massive aura that Rowan's soul point revealed, a change occurred and suddenly the power that the aura revealed increased once more. Inside Rowan's body, the soul points had never stopped trying to penetrate his bloodline, even if it was futile, and now instead of the usual single point attempting to penetrate the bloodline. An astonishing change occurred, perhaps due to the blockage caused by the bloodline traits, and every soul point now labored to enter the bloodline at once. What it caused inside the bloodline origin was catastrophic. The aura that the soul points emitted before suddenly multiplied in volume, and shrouded most of the ocean, and this formless aura did not stop its spread at the Empyrean bloodline ocean, for it exceeded even that and proceeded towards the very source. At the edge of the bloodline origin, were incredibly ancient Empyrean, older than any living memory. These Empyrean had outlived even the universe that birthed them, and each of them was larger than a galaxy. They all bowed towards the beginning of the bloodline origin, and it seemed they have been at that position for an infinite amount of time. At the beginning of the bloodline origin was an area of dense fog that spanned multiple universes in scope. It was impossible for a mind lesser than a god to even fathom the scale of this fog. Myriad lights and ephemeral echoes emitted from this area, and in a tiny part of it, a trickle of golden blood escaped from the edge. It was this trickle that created the entire bloodline origin for Empyrean. From that fog, it was possible to see massive mystical chains that seemed to have no permanent state. They fluttered between the corporeal and spiritual, and each chain could contain entire galaxies. Those chains were uncountable in numbers, and they ran through the fog, and seemed to contain it. The aura of the soul point spread past the chains and into the fog, and it was swallowed, leaving no trace behind. The chains began to shudder as something resembling a voice escaped from that fog. It was guttural and deep, and it was not something that any living creature should be able to speak out. The chains began to give out deep clanking sounds that echoed all over the universe, and more chains were summoned, and the voice escaping the fog stopped. In the commotion, A drop of black blood shot out from the fog with an indescribable speed, and the chains were too slow to stop the escaping blood, which shot into the bloodline origin of the Empyrean and disappeared. Chapter 62 I Am Legend 7. One of the kneeling primordial Empyrean trembled as the blood drop shot past it. It was in the shape of a sphere, but the sphere was made up of massive coils of countless serpents and dragons. Atop the sphere was a sleeping female, and everything below her waist was what made up the coils of reptiles and dragons. Her hair was made up of countless serpents, and if we put the size of this ancient primordial Empyrean into perspective, each strand of her hair should be larger than an entire belt of solar systems. She began to awaken, but in the time span that such an ancient Empyrean operates, it would be in another 17 million years before her eyes would open, and for an ancient Empyrean, that was a blink of an eye. That blood drop passed through the entire bloodline origin and the golden ocean froze. The 3 hovering bloodline rune that stood before Rowan's aura were destroyed. It would take countless years for them to be reformed. The black blood drop silently merged with that aura, and Rowan's path to the legendary state was unlocked as the soul points flooded into his bloodline, but all the soul points were diverted into that black drop of blood, which began transforming. The blood drop seemed to be shifting through countless possibilities to find the best manner to fuse with Rowan. The transformation stopped when it became 3 runes that resembled obsidian, that was shaped like a blade. It pierced through his heart, and they rapidly began turning black. The black hearts released thin lines of black metallic tendrils that carved a path through Rowan's chest, and slowly a 4th heart was being created. The snakes around his hearts became agitated, and giving out long hisses they began to attack his first 3 hearts, and horrifyingly began consuming it. Rowan's heart presently was tougher than diamonds, but the snakes sliced through it like a hot knife through butter, and each bite made Rowan's body twitch. They secreted venom that halted the regeneration of his heart, and when his heart was devoured halfway, his soul awoke. But his mind was blurry, he was still fragile, and the transformation of his soul was just beginning. He helplessly watched his hearts being entirely consumed by the snakes, and after they finished consuming it, they began giving out silent wails of pain. Well, good for you. Rowan thought inside, you ate my heart. Clearly it does not agree with you. The disturbance they gave was massive, and their wails became louder, and simultaneously they all rushed to escape his body, and since he had no direct control over them due to his weakened soul, they simply tore out of his body in a spray of golden blood. One snake burst out through his mouth. It was as large as a python, and it continued shooting out of his mouth with deadly momentum, and even after more than 30 feet of its body had escaped from his mouth, it was not the end, and more was still coming out. The force of its emergence tore his throat to shreds, and his jaws were dislocated. The entire length of the snake finally came out to 70 feet long as its tail finally left his ravaged mouth. Another snake burst out from his left chest and the last from his stomach. They emerged with such violence his body was nearly torn in 3. The pain for him was meaningless. He sought to understand what was happening as well as observe the snakes that just left his body after consuming his hearts. His body was rapidly healing, but the location of his hearts was noticeably empty. His blurry sight captured the 3 massive 40-foot snakes hovering above him. He noticed that they were beginning to shed, for their scales were previously golden, but now, beneath the skin was presently a darker gold scales. With a great hiss, they simultaneously discarded their previous skins, and they began to circle in the air while giving out hisses of joy. They also began to expand rapidly. Rowan noticed that each snake had grown a little to 75 feet long. Each of them seemed able to fly without any aid. Their faces were not like snakes, but more like dragons, and the snakes had distinct appearances. The first one that burst out from his mouth had only a single eye like a cyclops. The large orb was entirely white and covered a large portion of its face. Its scales were dark golden with white stripes along its stomach. The second, that came from his chest, had 2 red eyes that appeared remarkably close to humans. Rowan saw it even had lashes. This one seemed to have a gentle nature. As it stopped hissing and began looking around curiously, its scales were a light shade of gold, and numerous purple dots covered its scales. The last from his stomach had 3 eyes, with the third being at the center of its head. Its eyes were slit like a reptile, and its gaze was cold. Unlike the other 2 snakes that had an aura of majesty, this one emanated brutality and bloodthirst. It was golden red, with the red almost overtaking its gold coloration. Its head were now as large as a cart, and it began turning both ways, as its tongue flickered from its mouth, as if it was scanning the environment for prey. Its eyes became fixed on the hovering black eye that was still continuously generating a soul storm around Rowan's body. Faster than Rowan's sight could follow, it attacked. The opened mouth was like the gates to the abyss, as massive needle, sharp teeth began to grow inside its mouth at a rapid pace, its mouth closed over the eyes, and its body swayed as if it was chewing on the eye. The eyes of the third snake were slightly closed as if in enjoyment. No, it was enjoyment. As Rowan was beginning to detect a growing connection between him and the three hovering snakes. He felt a phantom pain, as the head of the snake chewing on the eyes of a primordial keeper exploded. That action caused the other two snakes to react as they released an aura of barbaric savagery. Even the gentle second snake with the human eyes seemed to transform into a creature of endless bloodthirst, and they began attacking the eyes. The head from the third snake had already reformed as the scattered pieces of its head transformed to golden mist and fused back to its flesh, and in seconds it was whole again. Rowan stared in dumb amazement. It joined the attack, and again all three of their heads were blasted apart, but they reformed their heads and relentlessly attacked. Each of them had grown needle-sharp teeth the size of long swords, that made a shrill sound as they cut through the air. Rowan was detecting a formless energy flowing down the head of the snakes and into his body. It was cold, and he nearly gave out a moan of pleasure, as this energy seemed to be massaging his soul and was transforming it. That energy went into the Soul Caesar bloodline, and Rowan did not have to check, but he knew the bloodline was evolving even without him using any soul points. Somehow, even though the snakes were repeatedly being destroyed, they seemed immortal and they were currently plundering vital essence from the eye. Giving out a furious scream that reverberated through the horizon, the eye began to ascend, clearly intending to leave, but the snakes pursued it. Their speed was ghost-like, and in the short while before the eye vanished from the material world, the snakes had repeatedly bitten and plundered a lot of its essence. It appeared dispirited and weak, but it gave out a final scream that pushed away the snakes and reality was torn apart as it fled into a crack in the middle of the sky. Chapter 63 I Am Legend Final. The snakes hovered in the sky, giving out mighty roars of exaltation. They must not have been cold-blooded, for he could see faint steam emanating from their mouth, and he could sense the fire in their blood. FCK me. When do snakes roar? Seriously, though, should that be the primary thought in my mind now? Rowan rubbed his healing chest and began to stand up. He unleashed all his senses first to analyze his surroundings. The link between him and the flying giant snakes was becoming more intimate, as he could almost sense himself inside them, flying through the sparse clouds under the red moon. The sensation almost felt like a fever dream. His mind was split into 3 extra sections, and even though he could not control his motion, he felt like he was in the driver's seat of a roller coaster. Using his energy sight, which had surprisingly gotten more powerful, he saw a thick stream of energy linking him and the 3 snakes. Now and then a pulse of power flowed down the snakes and entered his body, and he felt himself noticeably becoming stronger. In his energy sight the snakes burned like a furnace, as they resembled an endless source of energy. There seemed to be a certain energy reaction occurring inside their bodies which released a burst of energy that flowed down the link and into his body. Rowan closed his eyes for a few seconds and allowed himself to breathe calmly, knowing he was alive because of sheer luck and a little practical reasoning. He had no time to fully experiment with his abilities and knew he was lucky that his conjectures were correct. The only reason he was alive was not just because of the graces of his people who gave up their soul light to illuminate his own. It was because even in the heat of battle and numerous problems, he was still thinking about the uses of his abilities. The last time he was awake, he was at the edge of death, his soul at the boundary of dissipation, and he was furious at the powers playing with his life. He had made a gamble, hoping his intense desires would fuel his actions. Even if he were to fall, he had poured his intent into his soul, conveying out all his longings to live, to ascend beyond the mortal coil, to surpass all those who would do him harm, and to protect all that he was coming to love and cherish. Rowan had made it. He survived against the odds, and he knew that the best chance to kill him was gone. He was not necessarily bragging because he knew that the board had shifted. Not only that, but he had escaped his most trying moments. After all, how much threat could he have been before? He had held on with his last breath for longer than was possible, and he was a man at the end of his ropes, and even though he saw many suspicious events, he tried not to ruffle feathers. But no more. Now he had awakened, beneath that red moon, with the 3 flying snakes overhead that appeared closer to him with every passing moment. He spread his arms wide, letting the winds of this world blow over his naked form. His blonde hair was now shoulder length, and on his face was a slight growth of beard. His eyes were now more enigmatic, as it seemed to give out light. I am legend. His 3 companions suddenly roared. Their voice had a penetrating quality that made the surroundings vibrate. They were expressing their excitement. He could feel the power coursing through his veins like magma, and unlike previously when he was feeling a faint sense of lethargy in his soul, currently he has never felt so alive. He could not help himself and gave a loud roar too. The three snakes joined him, and for a while only their cries of excitement were heard. Can you see me? His roar seemed to communicate with the souls that gave him a second chance. He did not fail their expectations. He reviewed himself with his sight, his body standing at 7 feet tall, with muscles to put a Greek statue to shame, accompanied by a streamlined beauty that only a body at perfection could bring. Beneath the surface of his body was an engine of power that thrummed with endless vitality and potential. His body felt present, as if his body had become more real. The alacrity in his soul made him aware that the curse of his fading lifespan was gone. He bent to pick up the axe, which was now very still. It had sucked all its energy inside, and if not for the growing veins of golden energy on the weapon which were now closer to the axe head, he would have taken it for dead metal. With his energy sight, he could see that the green color of the axe was not its true color. Instead, it acted as a sort of seal that bounded the true form of the axe. Rowan was not too surprised, for he knew the history of this weapon must be quite deep, and even though thanks to the axe he was granted the berserker aspect, he was still wary of the weapon. The growing vein of gold was his vitality, that had been eating away at the seal covering the weapon. Even when he was immortal, the essence he had funneled into the axe was not so easily digested. The weapon had been greedy in consuming his vitality. The desire to consume an essence such as this must have been very overwhelming, but it would seem that the opposite was happening, as his essence was slowly digesting the axe. He idly wondered what would occur if he finished stripping away the seals from the axe. It was part of his upcoming agenda, but it was not at the top of the list, and he did not need to put much thought behind it because his vitality was slowly consuming the seal on the weapon anyway. Even if he never got to use the axe anymore, it was not much of a bother because he now had weapons, 3 of them, and alongside the power he was feeling burning inside him, his body could be the most potent of all his weapons. He began folding the discarded snake skin, from their first shedding. It had a faint golden glow around it, and as he folded it, it felt like he was molding metal. He was not used to walking around naked, so he began wrapping the last snake skin around his waist, and with a few tucks here and there, it stayed right around his waist. With his ever-growing powers, he would need a material that he could safely wear. His body was extremely powerful and tearing through his clothes and armor was effortless. If he could craft a set of clothes using these scales, he would have solved an essential need of his. Although his body was beautiful in every aesthetic sense, he was not a shallow individual, and he would find it extremely off-putting to constantly change his clothes every hour. His body felt like an endless abyss filled with uncountable mysteries, that would take him an eternity to search through. But he had the primordial record, and he would soon receive his answers. Although he almost did not want to use the record and slowly delve into his abilities bit by bit, that was a luxury he could not afford. He expected that he would need to kill lots of people soon, and he needed to thoroughly understand all the weapons in his arsenal. He was about to open the primordial record, when he heard a frightening crack, and his surroundings shook. The blood sea ahead of him began to bubble, and a massive skull rose from the ocean. Chapter 64 Strings. The skull was of an avian beast, that had a long pointy beak. The red ocean poured from its 2 empty eye sockets, and it seemed as if it was weeping blood. A massive spinal column emerged from the ocean that was connected to the massive bones around him, and he realized that this being was far larger than he thought, and the body ashore was still a part of it. A greater part of its body was buried inside the bloody ocean, and as it arose, it brought a formless pressure that drove the breath away from his lungs. It appeared he might have overstayed his welcome. He hurriedly poured his spatial sight into the room below him. His mind tensed as he saw that whatever method the teleportation circle used, it would take a few more seconds to charge. Before he could leave, the pressure from the giant was beginning to mount, and then his snakes attacked. Gotta knit. They are like mindless brats, who bite everything that moves. The sounds made as their numerous sharp teeth ripped through the bones were spine-chilling. This was all disregarding the fact that they were consuming the body of a creature with powers that Rowan feared neared or were equal to a god. The reaction of the giant avian skeleton was a bit sluggish, but it soon shook in agitation, when the third snake with 3 eyes, which unlike its other 2 siblings who ate along the surface, it was focused on boring deeper into the skeleton. It must have reached particularly deep, for the skeleton gave a strange scream like nails scratching a board, and a green ghost fire emerged from its sockets. Its eyes blazed for a moment with that emerald flame before it spewed it at the 3 snakes, and they turned to dust, yet even before they died, they opened their mouths wide and greedily swallowed the flames. Quote. Rowan felt a thump inside his chest, and a frightening sense of weakness before his body steadied itself, and looking inside his body, he saw the 3 snakes had resurrected inside the void, where his hearts previously resided. Before he could give any instructions, the snakes burst out of his body with startling speed, driving him to his knees as they shot towards the giant. They emerged from his body, in a reduced form, before they rapidly expanded once more, which was a good thing because with their current size, they would kill him the moment they emerged from his body, as his constitution was like paper to them. Okay. He was never going to get used to that. The snake with two eyes with a more mild temperament did not rush into battle like its two siblings, but paused, and seeing the massive bones surrounding them, rushed towards the bones and began to take massive bites. Their stomach must be endless, for Rowan had seen it must have eaten more than twice its body weight. A massive rib bone began to wobble, as the two-eyed snake had eaten its connecting part to the vertebra. Meanwhile, the other two snakes were braving the onslaught of the giant head, who was spewing a fresh round of green flames. Both of them were blasted by the flames coming out of the eyes of the giant skeleton, and Rowan was surprised that the damage inflicted did not turn them to dust, instead only their scales and most of their flesh were burned off. Their skeletons roared in anger and charged ahead through the flames. Meanwhile, Rowan had been feeling a massive amount of pressure building up for a while now. He knew he had to leave, else if this giant erupted with whatever techniques it was brewing, he doubted he would survive it. Thankfully, the rune lit up before him, and he began to fade away. The two snakes ahead burned to ashes ultimately. They could not handle more of the flames, but they had swallowed a lot of it. The last snake seized the falling rib bone as they disappeared. Behind him the world shattered as the giant skeleton unleashed its endless fury, but Rowan was already inside the spatial passage. The last snake outside his body had its mouth opened wide as it was swallowing the rib bone, 8 times its length. The other two gluttons burst out of him, tearing his body apart, as they began fighting for the rib bone. In less than 10 seconds, they had finished consuming it. The spatial passage did not seem to have any influence on the massive serpents, as they flew around, and the three-eyed one began biting the glowing floor of the passage. The others looked around, and the one-eyed snake fixed on the axe in Rowan's hand, and charged over. No you don't. Rowan moved the axe away, but it had already a bit down on it, and Rowan did not know which of them was more surprised that the needle-sharp teeth did not penetrate the axe. The axe retaliated with a green glow that pushed the snake away, shaking its head in annoyance. It joined its siblings in roaming the spatial passage and occasionally biting at the walls and floors, leaving a glowing imprint of their teeth on them. Rowan wanted to laugh at their silliness, as he felt that he was looking at babies that were mouthing. Everything was new and fresh in their eyes, and everything must be tasted. He almost wanted to let them play, as he took the time to check the primordial record, but that was before the passage vibrated, and the snake with 3 eyes reared up as it swallowed a massive pile of glowing gems from the passage floor. Rowan's face went black as chaos erupted all over the passage, and it began to shrink. Outside the passage was only the chaos of endless space. He began running towards the green door. The snakes screamed in surprise and instead of fleeing, continued attacking and eating the shrinking passage. Rowan's anger was beginning to mount as he forcefully pulled them into his chest, and with a force of will, he opened the green door and reappeared inside the mansion. The gem behind him began to crack. He turned around in anger, as in less than 3 seconds the massive yellow gem collapsed into dust. The wave of breeze blowing towards him as they filled the void the gem left behind, did nothing to chill his growing outrage. An endless source of soul points just disappeared because of the need for these gluttons to feed their endless stomach. He felt like hitting something really hard, to reduce his frustration. But the wave of spatial powers that began to flow through his body made him pause as he watched his spatial sight beginning to grow. Its dimension was rapidly expanding, and soon he was able to effortlessly cover the entire room and most of the adjoining passage. The vision his spatial sight showed him got richer than before, and that eerie dimension that formed over him, when his body senses and his spatial sight merged, got stronger, as he effortlessly levitated a couple of chairs inside his sphere of influence. His anger was mildly tempered by this, but it still burned bright. The exuberant snakes became meek as they turned into a ball and hid their faces inside their coils. Looking at his growing fourth heart, would they soon become another new source of headache? In fact, how many hearts could he even have? His body did not seem to even need them at this point. His body was far from normal, and seeing as how it could hold massive living organisms, it was unlikely that space was an issue for him, so he had no idea how many hearts he could even end up having. Sigh. Now would be a good time to get knowledge from another Empyrean, but where would he find a being like that? This world must be like a speck of dust before their eyes. Well, it was time to check his record. He had held back long enough to settle his spirit. He hoped he was ready for the revelations it would show him. He was mistaken. Chapter 65, Bonus Chapter, Strings 2. P. Name. Rowan Kuranes. Age. 1133 thousandths. Strength. 716.7. Agility. 715.9. Constitution. 1100. Spirit. 280.7. Class. None. Title. Plain Walker. Chaos Blood. Aspect. Spatial Sight Tier 3. Berserker Tier 1. Skills. Enrage Level 10. Mortal State Completed Vortex Level 10. Mortal State Completed Bash Level 10. Mortal State Completed Dash Level 10. Mortal State Completed Smash Level 10. Mortal State Completed Combo Attack Level 10. Mortal State Completed. Passive. Decipher Language Complete Icy Soul Level 4. Records. Question mark 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 question mark. Chaos Blood, Level 1, 0 10 thousandths. Question mark 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 question mark. Reaver. Level 0, 0 5 thousandths. Legendary skill gained. Chaos World Engine, 3/3. World Seed Level. Minor World. Chaos World Seed Charge. Seed 1 313,876 1 billionths. Seed 2 308,776 1 billionths. Seed 3 765,665 1 billionths. Rift Rule gained. Absolute Body locked. Incarnation Path unlocked. Path gained. Chaos Territory Creation locked. Active Skill gained. World Soul Manipulation locked. World Recreation locked. World Merging locked. Aspect Upgrade. Spatial Sight Tier 3 Spirit plus 50. Bloodline Upgrade. Soul Reaver. Passive Skill Upgrade. Icy Soul Right Pointing Arrow Ice Fire Soul, Level 6, Spirit plus 150. Soul Point. 1458.4532. Remark. Nascent Titan. Rowan doubted it was less than 24 hours since he left for that world, and he had obtained a transformation beyond his wildest dreams. There was so much information on his updated status, that he did not even know where to start from. But seeing the many zeros beside his lifespan made him grin so widely he did not doubt that he resembled a clown. What does it mean to have 33,000 years of life? If he uses the historical events of his previous life as a time frame, that meant that he could have eaten with the pharaohs, had a chat with Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia, watched every rise and fall of human civilization, and he would be barely middle-aged. He could watch the very mountain corrode into sand, and the years for him would have the importance of minutes. What would such a lifespan mean for someone like him, who, combining his two lives, barely lived a grand total of 60 years? Going from 0 to tens of thousands in a few short moments was jarring, and his mind was numb trying to imagine the sheer scale of such a number. He solely doubted any dominator in this world had such an exaggerated lifespan at the legendary state. Even Rift State or Incarnation State dominators would be floored by his lifespan. Theoretically, if he kept growing stronger, then his lifespan would turn every single enemy he is currently having to dust. He could just take a nap for tens of thousands of years. The surface world would have changed 10 times over. But my enemies are not just fragile dominators, are they? Just the same way the dominators are slowly becoming ants before my might, I am less than an ant before the primordial keepers. He tempered his excitement. This might seem like an extremely long time to him, but with the timescale of the truly powerful it was nothing. His mind was still too fixated on his mortal life, and gathering truly universal powers would take an extremely long time. He pushed his focus to the rest of his attributes, his mind working the numbers with surprising ease, as his enhanced spirit made his thought flow to be smooth. Agility made his perception of time to be extremely slow, and gave him more time to think with every passing seconds. His stats were expected, as he had calculated how much he would gain from reaching the legendary state. His constitution had surpassed the Rift State and was now in the realm of Incarnation. Rowan's spirit growth never failed to surprise him, as it was an attribute he had never actively cultivated, but its uses to him were invaluable. Perhaps it was because he used those skills involving spirit far beyond their capabilities that they grew extremely fast. He now saw a slight disadvantage concerning his ever-growing physique, that is he may never get to push his physical skills to the limit because he was too powerful. What was the use of learning all the intricacies of waving around a sword, when a simple punch from you can level mountains? Rowan slapped that silly thought away from his mind. He just fled from a being who could have turned him to dust. Disregarding his lifespan, if he was trapped by that creature and repeatedly killed, in due time, he would die a true death. He sighed, aware that he was trying to run, when he should be walking. He should not be so eager to test himself against foes like that, but with his potential, he would inevitably get to that level. From the interface of the primordial record, it was clear that skills could grow, and its might could exceed his imagination. With the right skills, it might be possible to fight someone far above your level. Rowan was determined not to become lax in his journey towards power. He would use every available tool he had, until he had crushed all his enemies to dust. He was aware that his 7-foot frame was just a facade. It held within, a boundless growing mountain. His strength and agility dwarfed his previous self by a significant amount, and the world had now become extremely fragile to him. If he were to live comfortably, he would have to build his home out of adamantine or something similar. The thought of that brought him joy, to be able to live and discover what this world had to offer him, to slowly learn and build. He wished for such a life, but not yet. Not much time had passed since he awoke in this world, but the events that had occurred around him were branded into his mind. He could still vividly see every laughter. He could still feel the goodwill of the souls who gave him everything. How could he look their children in the eyes without doing his possible best to tear down all those who caused them pain? His blood began to boil, and the snakes were stirring. They were creatures with primal intensities. They held no fear or doubts, and they were relentless. He calmed himself. Everything would fall in its time. Whatever experiment they performed on him, he doubted they understood what he had become. The presence of a transmigrated soul brought about an intense shift in whatever laid down plan they had, that it would be impossible for them to correct them. He had a new title, Chaos Blood. Rowan wanted to find out the meaning via the primordial record, but it came out blank. Could the record not access the meaning of this title? That was surprising. He had assigned a mantle of omniscience on the primordial record, but it seems there were some things it could not even access. Rowan would like to think it was because he might be limiting this enigmatic black book in some manner. Apparently, the ascension to the legendary state came with many unknown factors, and the most likely cause was the legendary ability that came from his bloodline. He had a new title, and somehow all his pathways until the incarnation state had been unlocked. He tried accessing the locked abilities, to see if he could glean their meaning, but he could not. With his previous knowledge, he thought you had to select new bloodline abilities every time you broke through a state. But it seems like the ability he got from his bloodline was so powerful he could only utilize part of it in each state. What sort of ability could be that powerful? It pushed every successive abilities he might ever have to the side. It appeared to be powerful though, so he had no problems with the ability for now. He had 2 boxes. He had yet to check his legendary skill and his Soul Caesar bloodline upgrade. He still felt great apprehension from this skill, even though it was the true fuel behind his bloodline growth. Chapter 66 Strings 3. The bloodline was now Soul Reaver, and although they came across as similar titles, he did not doubt that this one was more powerful than the Soul Caesar bloodline. As his spirit grew, so too did his ability to comprehend esoteric forces and other fundamental laws. He was now more capable of understanding certain intricate flows of power. The Soul Reaver bloodline oozed power and control. It pointed to a path beyond the material universe, to the control of forces so abstract, that its presence could rewrite the laws governing reality. Yet, he had no desire to even upgrade or utilize the bloodline beyond its soul collection ability for the moment. If he could still collect soul points without any issues, he did not plan to touch this bloodline until he understood it well enough. He may be making a mistake, but he was unwilling to walk on blind in any matters concerning the primordial keepers. Unlike his Empyrean bloodline, he sensed malice from this other bloodline. His field of vision was still too small, as he had not gotten into contact with the wide world. Before touching this bloodline, he had to make sure he was prepared. If life itself was a chessboard, he was still a pawn. Even with all his potential, it would be easy to crush him. Maybe if he was a youth or a younger man with less experience in life, he may be willing to charge into battle without second thought. He was not a young man anymore, and even if he would fearlessly charge into battle, he would make sure he properly assessed his odds. The massive amount of soul point that was needed to develop the Soul Reaver bloodline also made his eyes twitch. He pushed this genie lamp to the side. It was tempting, and would likely have stupendous benefits, but he still had his fears that he was too ignorant about the true meaning of his Empyrean bloodlines. If this world had gods, Then it was not far-fetched to think they must have vast knowledge of other powerful beings. He doubted he would be able to collect any information from them, yet. But that was not the point. There must certainly be libraries, and other sources of valuable information he could be able to gather. At this time, he was in a cage, but he would soon break out, and his second source of weakness, lack of information, would be solved to a certain extent. It was not lost on him how peculiar his situation was. He may have had access to knowledge that could exceed the scope of everyone around him, but he was missing certain fundamental common information to tie together all this knowledge he had. He was like a mad scientist that could know the formula to the most complicated equation in existence but did not know how to tie his shoes, or cook his food. He was an idiot savant who knew of powers far beyond the gods, but could not understand the mortal stages that were below them. His perception dwelled on the second box he needed to uncover, his legendary ability. The presence of this ability emitted was strange. It seemed to faintly suppress his bloodline, as if it suppressed itself in order to fit inside him. He guessed maybe it was because this bloodline ability was too powerful, and even though his attributes were extremely inflated for a legendary state dominator, he was still too weak to harness its might properly. Just the legendary ability that was randomly selected by his unconscious self had such a vast aura behind it. He felt humbled. Was this just a random bloodline ability, or did he just win the lottery? The snakes in his heart actually began to stir, as this ability had become intrinsically connected to them. It was a stark reminder that however he had grown, he was still an ant in the sight of the truly powerful. Speaking of ants, Rowan's hand snapped out like a whip and seized an invisible object. It quivered in his hand, making long hissing sounds, before it revealed itself. It was an eyeball with bat wings grafted to its sides. The pupils were silver, and it dilated rapidly, as if it was scanning him. Rowan felt an intense revulsion, not just because this thing had essentially been a voyeur watching every move he had been making, but because from it, he could sense the aura of that hooded figure. Now that he really thought about it, he knew where he had seen a lesser version of that aura. It was from the abomination thrall that was causing havoc inside the mansion. It was a testament to how distracted he was that he did not take time to do an in-depth scanning of all the individuals inside the mansion, but all that was soon to end. He wondered if that father knew he was working beside an abomination thrall. Knowing him, he doubted he would care. The third prince was a man who wears faces like a mask, but one thing Rowan could be sure of, was that he was worse than any abomination thrall. It was clear now that he was being closely monitored, both by visible and invisible eyes, but he doubted they knew how powerful his bloodline was, else they would have killed him when he was immortal. Even the primordial keepers knew of the threat he posed, and they crossed from outside the universe to kill him. He knew they must have a part to play in him receiving the primordial record, but he doubted they knew what his bloodline was because from what he could understand from the primordial record, the bloodlines he had access to must have a fundamental connection with him. The bloodline of Scion of Light and Scion of Darkness must have been linked to the previous prince, so if Rowan had not transmigrated, he was sure that the prince would have only had the option of those two choices to select from. The abnormality that arose was him. He was sure his soul crossed a different universe before it arrived at this body, and he brought with him the touch of the primordial keeper, for he was a soul that escaped their grasp, so he was sure that the primordial record used that connection and made this bloodline available to him. He had a hint about how he got the Ouroboros bloodline. For one, he did not remember how he died. He was sure he had been drinking, but that was it. Furthermore, he was still healthy and kept himself in great shape. But he remembered the introduction to the Ouroboros bloodline, where he saw an Empyrean tear through a planet as it was born. What if that planet belonged to his previous life? After all, he was alive one moment, and in the next, he was inside another man's body, although that body was a child then, but that was not the point. That should be the most reasonable explanation of how he got that bloodline, an unlucky or a very stubborn soul that had his body destroyed by an Empyrean and escaped the clutch of the primordial keepers. This chance of each individual event happening on its own was very unlikely, for the three such events to happen to the same soul, killed by an Empyrean, escaped the primordial keepers and transmigrated to another world or universe was so infinitesimally small that he knew he was unique in all creation. Although it sounded very boastful when he thought of it, in that way, it was most likely the truth, so that would mean that although he was in a bad position previously, he just needed a slight advantage to pull ahead in the race. He had solved the issue of his lifespan, and now it was time to attack. He was not used to allowing those who would do him harm a moment's respite. He would take his advantages and use it to tear apart this charade. Chapter 67 Strings 4. Rowan squeezed the eye, turning it to mulch. Suddenly his palm opened, and a mouth filled with many sharp teeth seized the pulped eye and retreated. Rowan paused. Of course it had to be the three-eyed snake. That little glutton was simply the worst among all three of his siblings. He saw that this meal only gave it a single energy value, but that would never stop it. He gave the snakes assurance that they would soon be feasting on better meals soon. Sighing, he called up his legendary ability, and from the depth of his bloodline, he understood what it was, and he nearly fell to the ground in shock. He had to place his hands on the wall, and he disregarded his strength for a while, and his hand effortlessly went through the concrete walls. He distractedly pulled his hands away from the wall, his mind screaming in shock. Should something like this be possible? With everything that had happened to him, it would be tough to break his mind. He had no doubt that outside this place, the world would be filled with wonders beyond what he could presently imagine, but the scale of this ability that was within his grasp was frightening. He felt such a power was not to be given to anyone. Although he had seen creatures of immense powers, the potential of this ability of his would be unmatched. Rowan replayed the memory that the primordial record showed him, when he checked the details of this ability. His mind had blurred, and he was transported to another location, where he saw a blue planet that reminded him of his first world. His sight was transported into the planet, where he saw luscious forest and grand oceans. Beasts of all shapes and sizes roamed this beautiful world. The skies were blue, and the air smelled like flowers. Abruptly, the blue sky turned red, as a falling object blazed down towards the planet, leaving purple contrails like a comet. He knew that was a world seed. The seed impacted on an ocean, throwing a wave thousands of feet into the air, and it quickly reached the bottom of the ocean, where it drilled into the core of the planet. In the core of the planet, it began to rapidly disperse itself, and it took root. Using the energy from the planet, it began releasing massive branches, hundreds of kilometers long, that penetrated the entirety of the planet. When the branch had occupied the entire core of the planet, it began releasing tiny, invisible spores that enshrouded the planet. Decades passed. Gradually, the vegetation of this planet began to change, followed by its beasts and insects, even down to its microorganisms. The planet slowly became the living heart of an empyrean. The evolutionary pathway of the planet changed, and massive beasts and powerful sentient races were born from the indigenous species, who resembled more of their creator's image with every generation that passed. The last thing the vision showed him was a colossus with 8 arms and 4 heads, holding a planet in each hand. The world he held was a hell world with beings that resembled asuras. Their mighty roars reached space. The details of this ability streamed into his mind. Chaos World Engine. Create a world engine that births world seeds. After seeding 10,000 worlds, the Chaos World Engine would be upgraded. World Seed Level. Minor World Right Pointing Arrow, Major World Right Pointing Arrow, Realm. World. Chaos World Engine, Minor. Engine 1 313,876 1 billionths. Engine 2 308,776 1 billionths. Engine 3 minus 765,666 1 billionths. Well, this ability was broken as hell, but it did nothing to drastically improve his powers at the moment, but the potential of this ability was limitless. Thinking about its utility almost made cold sweat pour from his brows. By now, he did not trust that the vision he saw was the true limit of his ability. The Empyrean he saw in that vision seeded 8 planets, but according to the primordial record, his Chaos World Engine could create world seeds, and for the ability to be upgraded, he would have to seed 10,000 worlds. What made this ability even more crazy when it fell under his hands was because each of his snakes were theoretically a single Chaos Engine. That would mean for him to completely upgrade this ability, he would have to seed 30,000 worlds. Damn. It was a good thing that there were plentiful worlds in the universe, else he would be stumped on how he was to go about seeding worlds. How could he get to those worlds? Well, not considering the fact that there were mystical methods to essentially teleport to foreign worlds like the ones his snakes just destroyed. He did not find it such a bad idea to seed the world he was in right now. I mean, why search far and wide for something, when you could find it right beside you? Okay. If he understood this correctly, a world seed could transform a planet into your domain. Everything inside the planet would be molded in your image, and the entire resources of the planet would be at your disposal. Just the resources from a single planet, the indigenous species, the massive ether it generates, and many more benefits were simply incalculable. What would it mean to seed 30,000 worlds, or even more? Would he be able to create armies from his seeded planet that could cover an entire galaxy? How powerful would he become if he could have access to ether from 30,000 different planets? It took a while for him to settle down, maybe this ability did not come with an immediate leap in his combat capabilities, but it would eventually surpass any sort of ability he could ever have. He might also be wrong about the immediate usage of this ability, for he remembered the sheer adaptability of the snake, that he was sure was a side effect of them being the host of the Chaos World engine. They could consume any energy and still gave him tangible benefits from those consumed materials. Besides, he did not really need any more fancy abilities, his body was a powerful weapon all on its own, and the more he upgraded his bloodline, the more powerful he would get, and this would also reflect on the snakes too. They could be the perfect long-range attack he solely needed to round up his skill set. Coupled with the fact that they would swallow any energy given to them, made it very possible that he had any opponent in the incarnation state or below. He did not know the capabilities of his father and his other accomplices, but to play it safe, he should assume they were all beyond the incarnation state, then he would have to play it safe, but not too safe. He would need to test his capabilities shortly, and it was good enough that he had enough abominations to try his hands on. It would take time to gather the amount of energy needed, but knowing the gluttonous habits of the snakes, and their seeming immortality, if he let them loose, they would gather massive amounts of energy in little time. He should really begin thinking of names for the snakes, especially if he was growing more hearts, which translate to more snakes in the future. But what sort of names would fit these creatures? The usage of his present attributes made him flow through his thoughts in no time. To the outside world he may have appeared to be deep in thought for a short while, but he had already made many plans going forward. Leaving future matters aside, it was time to deal with the present situation, starting from the invisible eyes watching him to the invisible strings that were bounding him. Inside his domain, he could clearly sense the flying eyes and the three invisible strings that bound his head, heart, and eyes. Chapter 68 Strings 5. A boy with white hair, carrying two heads stood before the shore of the Sylvan Lakes. Behind him was a trail of gore. The journey must have been more than 10 miles, and he had bled through most of it. His blood he shed alternated between the vivid red of a human's blood and the muddy yellow of an abomination. These two opposite natures dwelled inside his body, and instead of the invasive blood of the abomination corrupting and taking over his body, it seemed to have been stalled. For every time, the foul blood of the abomination rose to take over his body, and inhuman resolve from the boy pushed it back. It could be seen by the white hair on his head, coupled with the heavy wounds on his body, that this boy had suffered far beyond what any human should. Rigolf had forgotten everything, except for two things. He was starving, and he had to protect Stisa and Mama. It was all that occupied his mind. Pain went by in a haze, and in the depth of his madness he kept hearing the same voice. It came with the voice of Stisa. Big brother, you are finally here with us. It came in the voice of Rose, his mother. Come closer to me, my child. Now and then, the hunger pangs would get too much for him, and via the urging of the voices, he would bend and eat off the bundle he held in his hand. The blood of abominations was powerful, but it could not be created out of nothing. The boy had been healed countless times, and that blood needed sustenance. Although there must have been something inside him that rebelled, making his healing wounds tear apart again and again. That resolve had gotten extremely twisted, for he slowly ate the last of the bundle in his hand. He let the bloodied cloth drop to the floor, and unexpectedly he began to wail, giving out a long drawn-out howl like a hyena, and as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Rigolf stood there by the shore, for what seemed like an eternity. As he stood, the water in front of him began to bubble, and massive shapes began to move within. In a short while, giant abominations began coming out of the lake. There were 3, 4, a dozen, until finally 14 giants stood before the lone figure of the boy. Some of them eyed him with various eyes scattered all over their bodies, but soon looked away in apparent disinterest. In the case of Rigolf, if he could see them, he gave no indication, he just stood and stared at the lake as if he were waiting for something. A soft sigh came from the lake, and the 14 giant abominations that stood at its shores went still like statues. As one, they all turned towards the lake. A solemn voice came from the depth of the water. If any mortal had heard it, their bodies would have exploded on the spot, their souls would be crushed and their lineage cursed. A dominator would be transfixed and would, shortly after, a grisly fate much worse than death would follow. The time draws near. My wait is nearly over. A mother loves all, even the least of her children. A drop of gray blood rose from the water. The water parted around it, and the air seemed to burn. Poor children. Take of mother's breast. You shall starve no more. The giant abominations went crazy and began to attack each other. The battle was not quick, even though they did not defend themselves. They tore each other apart and their nature worked against them as they healed quickly. But their perseverance to kill and devour the other was inhumane, and soon they began to consume each other. The saliva from their mouths seemed to restrict the healing capabilities of their bodies. It was a grisly affair, and the screams from the fallen giants being devoured would send chills down the spine of anyone. Bone and flesh were chewed and torn apart, and the yellow blood flowed into the lake in a small flood. A single giant was soon left, and this one was very nightmarish. It had devoured the 13 other abominations, and its body was shattering apart. It had become a creature of pure disorder. None of its features could serve any visibly sensible purpose. It screamed with numerous mouths at the pale sky. The last giant abomination had more than 15 heads and an excessive number of limbs. Eyes grew under its feet and tongues grew from its chest. It stood more than 70 feet tall, and it began to grow other limbs that could support its weight, but they ended up exploding from the sheer weight of this creature. It screamed in fury, as it had yet to learn control over its new form that was proving too difficult for it to effectively control. Bones grew out of its skin and from its numerous opened mouths came out human hair, which flowed in long silken strands. The giant cried out in the voice of a host of devils. For many souls dwelled within it, and it could not find an equilibrium with itself. It shambled and slowly crawled towards the gray blood that was burning in the air. The sounds from the dozens of mouths in its body screamed of desire. When it got to the blood, the biggest mouth in its body opened. The mouth was located on a random shoulder. Inside that mouth was another mouth, and that one also opened to reveal yet another mouth, like a haunted Matryoshka doll. A final mouth opened and a thick green tongue that had ears growing on it and intestines entangled around it, stretched out like a decaying worm and lapped at the blood, like a dog. The mouth began to slowly disintegrate, and it screamed and returned into the body. Another mouth came, and it opened and also lapped at the blood. It soon began to fall apart, and it returned and another mouth came. The creature used the mouths from all over its body to lick the blood, and the giant abomination gradually began to shrink. It used that method to slowly whittle away at the drop of blood until it consumed half of it. Any more and it would destroy itself, for it was severely bleeding as the portion that disintegrated from touching that blood did not heal. When it appeared as if the giant abomination could no longer consume the blood, the remaining blood drop began to fall into the water. A sigh came from the depth. My children have fallen fart of realty. My milk left Taoist. A single great eye opened in the body of the shrunken abomination. The eyes were filled with lust, greed and other fell desires. The abomination suddenly leapt forward and opened a jaw that was the size of half its body and swallowed the blood drop. It curled into itself on the shore of the lake and it began to burn. Pieces of it liquefied and turned to black ooze, and it slowly shrank until it formed the shape of a placenta. A whispering voice that sounded like the chill of the abyss came from the placenta. Mother, your child comes. You are not good enough, little one. My champion is here. Chapter 69 Strings, Final. Regolf twitched and began to walk towards the milky white placenta. He seemed to have smelled a very pleasant fragrance, and the hunger that had been driving him to madness increased tenfold. He leapt onto the placenta, that was 10 times his size, and began to devour it. His teeth were too fragile, so he ended up breaking them, and when they got stuck, the force from his bite pulled them from their roots. He worked on the corner of the placenta for a while. It was very tough for his fragile human teeth to chew through, but even as he lost all his teeth, the yellow abomination blood soon grew new ones for him. His persistence finally paid off, and he managed to chew through a small section of the placenta, and began to drink the fluids inside. A panicked scream came from inside the placenta. Mother, why have you abandoned me? I was to be your champion. Hush, child. Time has changed. I would soon be free of my torment. In the new world that comes, you are too frail to endure in it. I do this for your sake. You should have believed in me. Mother, I would have prevailed. The voice from the placenta went increasingly weak until it faded. Meanwhile, the body of the white hair boy had been growing crazily, from the shrunken figure of a boy, to a healthy man. His white hair had grown until it reached his knees, and his mouth was fixed on that opening as he drank. Soon he began to shudder, and his body began to strain against something invisible. His body would grow to an extent before it was crushed down, as if by invisible hands. Behind him, the water began to bubble and fog rose from the water. The fog began to pulsate, in the rhythm of breathing, and as it swirled around, it was possible to see a massive entity inside. Unlike the sight that Rowan had seen, the gigantic head of the abomination core had truly arisen. It turned towards the manor, her eyes holding incomparable mysteries. Hold for a while, my champion. Soon we shall be free. The spikes in the numerous eyes in her hair continued to quiver, and it was possible to see tiny strings like spider webs on the body of the spikes. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Rowan's hands passed through the strings. They were intangible, but now that he could see them within his domain, it was possible to slightly feel them. It felt like strands of cobwebs that lightly brushed your skin, and beneath that physical sensation was a gut-churning sense of intense disgust. It was that familiar feeling he once felt when he had awoken in this world, and also when he touched the eye tattoo on his chest. He had already felt it before, but his senses were far too weak to understand what he was feeling at that time. He knew there was no way they would have left him with a tool such as the primordial record, without leaving safeguards. Rowan used his senses to trace the strings entering his body, and he saw that although it went through different parts of his body, which was his eyes, forehead and chest, they were all linked to the primordial record. They seemed to be bounding certain pages, precisely the first 6 pages. He had his curiosity at first, about why he was only able to access the 7th page of the primordial record. But since he had no idea about how the singularity works, it was a mystery he thought at first that he may never get to understand, but he should have been more discerning. To be fair though, he had no experience previously in singularity management. His mind began to work furiously, as he began reassessing what he knew about the singularity and the possible effects of the locked pages. Knowing he had no advantages beyond his omnipotent bloodline, and the ease by which he had acquired skills and aspects, he began to make plans and set contingencies for issues he could not anticipate because of his limited understanding of this world. DMN it. He needed further information. How was he going to find an unbiased source? Rowan had to rightfully assume that every source of information around him was compromised in subtle ways that might throw him off the truth. He would have to use the tools that he had available to him, and make do with it. Using his spatial sight, he began to zoom into the structure of the strings, which looked simple from afar, but viewing it at closer lengths, he saw that it may be one of the most intricate things he had ever seen. From up close, each of the strings resembled massive spirals of glowing lines that intertwined in many complicated manners and patterns that even with his spirit, he was unable to trace where one line started and another ended. They could almost be described as beautiful. These were a series of lines arranged in geometry beyond any mortal reason, and instinct told him that this was the handiwork of a divine being. Nothing else could reproduce something with such stunning complexities that it boggles the mind. Mind you, with his present spirit, Rowan would be able to understand and outperform many computers in his previous life in relation to pattern recognition, analytical reasoning and so much more. His spirit could effortlessly deduce every single trajectories of incoming missiles, energy bolts, various natural forces like gravity, wind, and even light entering his domain, and give him accurate results inside a chaotic environment like a field of battle. Yet with such a potent tool in his arsenal, he could hardly understand the glowing lines on a single inch of that string. There was also something extremely strange that happened the closer he viewed the strings. He began hearing screams, and not just any normal screams, but resonant howls that sounded extremely tragic. If he had ever wanted to know about what the sounds of hell would ever be, it was here. The screams were disturbing in their sheer intensity. There was no way to fake the sheer sense of terror and pain emanating from it. Rowan felt a blossoming feeling of fear in his chest. The screams touched something deep inside him, his mortal side, that he thought he had lost. I was never really free after all. He had a thought, and he commanded one of the snakes to touch a string. The serpent shrank itself, until it was the size of a small snake that was 4 foot long. It pierced through his bicep and crawled to his chest where it began to nibble on the string. Rowan heard and felt a part of the string beginning to give, and he commanded it to stop. Although he wanted to free himself quickly, he needed to make certain preparations. He would rather not be rash at this moment. The snakes had access to his consciousness, and it flew and began swallowing the invisible eyes inside the room. There were 3 reasons why he stopped cutting the strings. It was because he found their makeup very familiar, and it would take a short time to confirm his suspicion. He felt that if he cut this string already without verifying his suspicions, he may end up regretting it. The second was that there were too many eyes watching him at the moment. He needed to pluck them out. Both the invisible. Someone began knocking at the door. Young noble, your presence is being urgently requested. The voice belongs to Captain Titus. ... And the visible. Rowan paused before he replied, give me a moment. Rowan turned towards his wardrobe, to prepare for his final performance because after now, he was done playing games. The third reason was that, he had sworn to protect his people, he was saved from death by the goodwill of their fallen, he would take no action that may put them in danger, he would need to separate the wolves in sheep's clothing. He had only one chance to make it right. Chapter 70 Dawn of Battle. Two men sat by an open flame, one of them poked at the flames with his bare hand, to stoke the fire, as a succulent pig on a spit was rotating above it. Now and then, the figure takes a brush, and coats the roasting meat with a fragrant sauce, the scent of delectable roasting meat fills the air, there was a metal jug by the side of the fire, and a purple-colored wine was faintly bubbling inside. The aroma from the roasting meat and the bubbling wine filled the surrounding, bringing with it a relaxing atmosphere. The full moon overhead poured on the clearing where both men sat, and around them were the sounds of small animals and insects. It is unclear to me why you keep doing that. One of the men said. It was a hooded figure that was speaking, his face lost inside deep darkness that defied even the light cast by the fire. In some angles, it may even appear as if he had no head, only a hood covering a ball of darkness, and in his hands was a book, that was the exact replica of the primordial record. Unlike the primordial record that resides inside the body of Rowan, this one was tangible, and the first 3 pages could be opened, but it was seen that the pages were blank, and their color was white as bone. My spices are running out. What? Oh, you mean this? The third prince pointed at the barbecue and the wine. Well, I could say the same of you and your order, concerning that book. After all this time, you should know by now, that you will not be able to read it, you have a sort of control over it, should it not be enough. You have achieved what many couldn't, even the previous holders could not understand those damned words. Sigh. Just because you know how to use something, does not stop you from trying to learn how it works. Moreover, saying we have control over the singularity is false. 10,000 years of sturdy and we have barely scratched the surface. When you put it that way. Anyway, replying to your first question. The third prince cut a large part of the roasting pig, and started eating it. He took a long swig from the hot wine and said, I think it was maybe 400, or possibly, it was 500 years ago, when I came across a particular barbarian tribe in the north. Why am I not surprised that you would visit places like that? The hooded figure said as he carefully closed the page of the black book and kept it inside the fold of his voluminous robe. Why wouldn't I? Although our abilities are severely suppressed on that continent, and dying to the countless dangers there is easier than breathing, I am telling you, my friend. Nowhere, and I mean nowhere else in this world would you find food better than that place. You don't say, the hooded figure replied disinterestedly. Maybe it's because of the countless herbs and spices they have. The third prince eagerly gestured as he took a healthy bite from the meat, oil staining his lips, are their tradition of selective breeding of their population into various castes, so you have an entire family who for hundreds of generations have always been cooks or butchers. Not just that, even in the family of butchers, they have individual units who only kills just one specific animal or cook only a single dish. Imagine perfection honed over countless years. It was clear that the third prince was very passionate about the subject of food. I have eaten all sort of delectable cuisines on all 5 inhabited continents, from the palace of kings to the slums with beggars. I have tried every known dish and also some lesser known ones, but nothing beats the barbarians. He took the time to chug down his wine, and swirled the jug. As he did, tiny strands of moonlight gathered inside the jug, and it was refilled by the purple wine. Back to your question, this particular tribe was of warriors who had a tradition of feasting before a battle, which in itself is not a particularly strange event. Everyone else does it, but what caught my attention was the spice. The hooded figure was getting a little more interested in his story. What's up with the spices? He. This is a good one. They're prisoners of war. Men, women and children are taken and nailed on wooden logs that are kept in a few feet of water, so the logs can soak up moisture, and the herbs and spices are grown on their living bodies. I want you to imagine flying over miles and miles of fields with such delightful red herbs that from the skies look like a carpet made of sunset. The scent of the herbs carried by the wind was beyond compare, while, below it, the screams of countless people. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Rowan pushed the door open. The captain's eyes became fixed on his chest, no doubt expecting someone smaller. His eyes slowly traveled up to his face, and they widened in surprise. To his credit, he was quick on the uptake. he quickly recovered his composure and his discerning eyes pored over the details of Rowan's face. There were portraits of him inside the manor, and even though he was now 7 feet tall, with a chin that could cut glass, he still had his boyish looks. His golden serpentine eyes only served to enhance his features. His shoulder-length hair resembled gold threads, and they highlighted his face, almost as if he had a halo behind his head. He was wearing a pressed black trousers, with a white silk long-sleeved shirt with gold buttons. He left the first 3 opened. Over it, he wore a dark red long coat, with the emblem of the Kuranes family on the left shoulder, which was an erupting volcano. In his left hand was an axe, that had a golden shaft, with a green axe head that was tainted by golden veins. A closer look would reveal that the area where the golden veins were concentrated on, was the spot where the snakes had bitten into, when it wanted to eat the weapon. Lord Rowan, you are. The captain, even with his composure, found it hard to describe the present state of Rowan. He was breathtaking, not only because his appearance could be described as perfect, but his sheer presence was palpable. This was brought about not only by his massive attributes, but also his Empyrean bloodline that had repeatedly evolved and transformed his body countless times over. His bloodline was, originally, extremely domineering, and Rowan was a cut above the rest. He had just entered the legendary state, but his presence reminded Captain Titus of his superiors, those lofty and distant figures whose existence seemed to wrap reality around them. Only the extreme horror in his heart could shadow his surprise, and then Rowan spoke. The sound of his voice dragged him away from the reverie he was under. The captain noticed his voice had become deeper, yet possessing a rich quality like a finely tuned musical instrument. He felt his heart shake, and he became slightly confused because for an instant, he had the urge to worship him. There must be an important reason why you disturbed me, Captain. I gave clear instruction that I should be left alone. Did something urgent come up? Yes, my lord. Something happened inside the manor that we found critical enough to bring to your notice. Maeve is busy with setting up the sigils, and this might turn out to be extremely difficult on morale, if not handled properly. If that is the case, lead the way, Captain. Captain Titus saluted, and turned around as he began walking briskly towards the stairs, where he began descending to the first floor. Chapter 71 Dawn of Battle 2. Walking behind the captain, Rowan tried to ignore the screaming that he now heard constantly from the strings inside his body. He briefly wondered how it was possible that he could have been deaf to the commotion from these strings all these while. Occasionally, around him, a small mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth would appear and seem to take a bite out of the air, and promptly disappear. Rowan discovered the snakes could shrink until they were as small as a single thread. Knowing this, he let them out, so they could hunt the flying eyes inside the mansion. The captain must have sensed something, for he looked back and around him. Is everything all right, Captain Titus? You appear nervous. Nothing, my lord. It must be the strain of the last few days on my mind. I understand. It has not been an easy period for us all, but I promise you that together we will free ourselves of this nightmare. They proceeded towards the back of the manor, and the captain opened the door in front, where a group of people gathered, and they appeared distraught. They were mostly men, and a few women, who held swords and shields, with a few crossbows held by 4 of the women. The rest of the women and children were kept in the expansive cellar underneath the manor, where the staff and the remaining survivors were. Certain hushed whispers went on between the people. The moment Rowan entered the room, everyone went silent, as they all felt a certain pressure inside their chest. Rowan had never learned any skill to hide his aura, and his presence was becoming difficult for mortals to bear, for it was beginning to carry a formless weight. Rowan felt it was doubtful if any disguise skill would ever do him good, for he had 2 omnipotent bloodlines, and he was becoming strong. He was a young chick that had now begun learning to fly, and as an Empyrean, he was destined to walk across stars. The earth could not contain his steps for long. Although unaware of it, that knowledge touched the heart of every person in this room, and Rowan's eyes widened slightly, for he could see the changes in everybody in the room. He saw the quivering in their bodies, the way their pupils dilated, their hearts beating out of rhythm, and the increasing frequency of their breathing. He had felt that way once before in his previous life. It was when he climbed to the top of a mountain, and he had seen all the lands stretched far into the horizon. He had felt so small. Although he had felt the same feeling countless times over since he came to this world, he did not expect that feeling to be directed towards him, and for an instant, he felt a bit of shame. There might be some bad eggs among some of them, but for most of them, this was not how he wanted them to view him, as if he was a sort of god, or a messiah. He was aware of the reverence given to nobles in this world, and he wanted none of it, for he did not feel that he deserved any of it. The only reason he was alive, right now, was the result of the sacrifices of their kin. He looked around, and through the souls that gave him their light, he saw their loved ones reflected through it. Rowan paused, and he began calling them by name: Bjorvir, Bilal, Maramir, Genmir, Vigil, Stikmar, Verival, Ronir, Renair, Rokal, Burin, Dalrin, Dormilla, Hilly, Dordis, Declara, Nori, Brisha, Darni, Kriya, Swerma. You have done well. Names are important. As one of the few things people consider as something truly of their own, it gives them a sense of identity beyond what most material possessions can ever give. In this world, to some people, their names are the most precious of possessions. Rowan saw them perk up. The familiarity of their names being mentioned by him broke a barrier that would have built between them if he had let it continue. Whatever went wrong, I will take it from here. Rowan had seen their eyes were fixed on a particular door. Before he entered, "My lord, is that you?" Declara, the stern owner of the Flying Hog, the only pub in town. Rowan smiled and nodded. "Well, you've certainly been eating a little too much, haven't you?" He had nearly forgotten her shrewd mouth. "I miss you too, Declara." "Stand back, all of you." "Of course, my lord," she said. "It's the priest. Something's wrong with him. It began a few minutes ago. He suddenly started screaming, and anyone who got close to him lost their heads. It's just popped open." Her eyes were filled with the dawning horror of remembrance. Rowan had already shot a burst of his sight through the doors and saw a shivering figure on the floor. Around him were dozens of invisible flying eyeballs. "I will take care of it." He walked towards the door and brought his hand to the handle, as the screams from the strings seemed to intensify. Asterisk 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 asterisk. "That's an interesting story. I have never heard of that tribe," the hooded figure said. "I would be surprised if you did," said the third prince, one of the many casualties of the great push into the northern continent. "They were along the path I took, and I did not know it then. The brilliance of their work, else I would have spared some of them. These are the last batch of spices and herbs I collected from their farms. As fascinating as all these sounds, you still missed my point. You do not need to eat all these." The hooded figure gestured to the meat and wine. "They are pointless, and in the long run are meaningless. You know there is a reason why no one likes you." The third prince frowned. "There would be many things in this life you would be blind to, my friend, because you refuse to see life as it should be seen. Your experience is behind a glass. You have shielded yourself from the very thing you sought to understand." Fascinating. "So, you think the way I should understand life is to grovel in the dirt with the maggots, and eat tea with the dogs?" "No. Yes. That is precisely my point. Life is to be experienced, not watched. I have no doubt that you know of millions of profound knowledge and events, but I would bet you have never tried to partake in any of them. And here I thought you were an enlightened being. Hey, don't knock it until you try it. Tell me, when was the last time you went to the beach and got your feet wet? When was the last time you left the shadows of your robes and saw light in all its glory?" He must have hit a nerve, for the hooded figure growled, "That is not relevant. I am stronger than you because I focus on my goals, without distractions." Ouch. Low blow. Here I thought Augustus was the petty one. The third prince paused for a while, as he cut more sizable chunks of meat and stuffed it inside his mouth. "I tried regrowing them, the spices, but the taste was never the same. I guess you can't replace centuries of knowledge and practice. I found no tribes with this tradition, and I have tried, but it makes a proper send-off, don't you think?" The third prince looked up at the skies, where a red line was tearing through the horizons, heading for them. Eating the last of such delectable flavor, before killing a child of Tiberius. Chapter 72 Dawn of Battle 3. Rowan closed the door behind him, turning to the priest, who jolted at the sound of the closed door, but his eyes were still closed, and his mouth opened and closed sporadically. By the side of the priest were the bodies of 3 people. Everything above their necks was gone, as fragments of blood and bone stained the floor and walls. It was a harsh callback to his time in that room. It appeared to be 2 men and a woman. He had an urge to cover their bodies with something. It felt inhumane to leave them like that. Rowan had shut off his energy sight, for he feared that his glowing eyes would draw too much attention. Activating it once more with a thought, his gaze fell on the priest. He discovered that everything about him was normal. His aura appeared dispirited, but it still blazed with warmth and health. Only his current state was an indication that something was wrong with him. Inside his domain, Rowan had seen there were more than 20 flying eyes clustered around the priest. A mental command to the snakes was all it took, and they began consuming the eyes. He noticed with every eye that was consumed, the shaking from the priest got worse, until he opened his mouth wide in a silent scream, and the sparse flying eyeballs left, just 3 of them, flew into his mouth and he snapped it shut. The priest gasped and sat up. Holding his head, he groaned aloud. He appeared disoriented for a short while, before collecting himself. Rowan's eyes tightened. In a brief moment when the flying eyeballs had entered the mouth of the dark priest, he had seen his aura shift. It happened very fast. There appeared to be a film covering the dark priest that could broadcast a sort of fake aura because in that small instance, when the aura had lifted, he saw the yellowish aura of an abomination. My lord. Apologies, it appears that I have caused great harm to my people. The eyes of the priest were filled with shock and horror, and tears threatened to pour from them. He looked around in a fit, calling the names of the bodies on the floor. He completely broke down, and began to cry. I am so sorry, Mersha. Levry, Afam, I don't know what happened. I am so sorry. Rowan walked up to the priest, and standing behind him, placed a hand on his shoulder as if in condolence. The priest began crying loudly, tears and snot running down his face. The commotion was so loud, that the door opened, and the people outside could see what was happening in the room. A bit of anger flashed through Rowan's eyes. He could see that the door was opened by the captain. He had been joined by the remaining guardsmen. The people looked inside confused at first, and seeing the kneeling priest who was crying his eyes out, compassion overcame them, and some of them began to tear up. My lord, I suspect it's the strain of battle that made him lash out and made his powers uncontrollable. Captain Titus said, by all accounts, he was a priest who hardly used his powers. It's no surprise that he broke down. This is my fault, my lord. I should have anticipated something like this from a non-combatant. The people hearing the captain looked at the priest in compassion. They knew that without his contributions, most, if not all of them would be dead. He was a kind man who placed his life on the line, and stood with them. Even colored by the sadness of their loss, their hardy nature prevailed, and Rowan knew at that moment these people had forgiven the priest for what happened here. Please, don't say that, Captain. I accept the blame for my actions. I should have known that using my powers in such an intense manner would cause a backlash. It is all my fault. We all understand. Purdue, we all bear scars. Declara said as she looked to the others for support, and they all nodded their assent. Please, let us focus on burying our dead and figure a way out of this situation. The priest, still crying his apologies, attempted to stand, but Rowan's hand was still on his shoulder and he could not. He looked up at Rowan, and made a weird expression, as if he was trying to smile, while still crying. My lord, I'm all right now. Please let me perform the least of my duties and say the last prayers for the people my negligence has killed. He attempted to stand again, but Rowan's hand was like a mountain, and he was an ant. He could not move an inch. In a bizarre manner, Rowan began touching the fabrics of the priest's black robes, a slight frown on his face. Is anything the matter, my lord? The priest stammered. He was clear something was wrong. The people also became silent, as the mood instantly changed. Rowan saw the guardsmen becoming tense, and he sighed. Is it not the clothes? No, it's the skin, right? Why, I don't understand, my lord. Easily picking him up with one hand by the shoulders until his feet dangled in the air, the priest grimaced in discomfort as he cried, my lord, punish me if you will, but let me say the last prayers for these poor souls. The people began to shift in discomfort, but Rowan ignored them, and he set the axe by his side so that the shaft rested on his leg. He seized a handful of the priest's robe and yanked it off. It tore apart in his hand like tissue paper. He was wearing a prayer chain around his waist, and gray briefs. It revealed his surprisingly toned body. He nearly forgot that the priest was a legendary state dominator, so his physique would still be far better than a mortal. Rowan ran his hand over the priest's skin as he looked at him with curious eyes. My lord, is something the matter? Captain Titus cried out. The priest must be under battle shock. Let me take care of. Silence, Captain. Do not speak unless I tell you. Rowan yelled at him. Forgetting the power of his voice, everyone inside the room winced, and they all fell silent. The captain's mouth closing with a resounding clack. Rowan turned to the priest and said, I thought you were a follower of the fallen god Malekith. Yes, my lord. The priest said as his teeth began chattering. His image of confusion and despair touched the heart of the people, and confusion and fear began growing inside their chest. The priest continued speaking, but that does not mean the rites I would say for the dead are blasphemous. I only wanted to pray for their souls. I do not recognize the god on the prayer chain around your waist. Rowan fingered the chains. I fear that is a misunderstanding. Malekith takes many forms, and unlike the orthodox gods, he chooses to wear any form of his choosing. Rowan sighed. Your cover is so perfect. Everything here reminds me of that father of mine. In everything he does, he leaves no stone unturned. He takes his game seriously. I grow weary of this endless charade. His left palm stopped over the chest of the priest, as if he was fondling him. My lord, I don't understand. The priest sorrowfully whispered. Rowan smiled sadly. Did they change you into this, or have you always been this way? With his palm on the priest's chest, he grasped the flesh and he pulled. The priest's torso exploded in a spray of blood, as Rowan held in his hands the skin of the priest. He had taken all the skin around the entire upper body of the priest. Chapter 73 Dawn of Battle 4. Rowan's strength was great, and his high agility and spirit gave him a strong control over his powers. Skin, although it was elastic, was still surprisingly strong and was fastened firmly to the muscles of the body, and a Dominator's skin was far tougher. If he had just pulled with brute force, he may have torn away the skin only on the priest's chest, but Rowan vibrated his palm at the moment he squeezed the skin, severing all the connection of the skin to the muscles, and as if he were pulling away clothes from a body, he tore the skin away from the priest. His screams were loud and shrill, as he wept in pain, and he kept apologizing to Rowan. The people cried out in shock and horror, as some of them tried to push forward to stop Rowan or plead to him, while being held back by others. My lord, Declara screamed, we all know he did wrong, but it was a mistake. She pointed to the bodies on the floor. Mersha was a sick child, the priest took care of her for years, my lord. Every single day for 3 years, he never failed to bring her the herbs that she needed, even if he had to scrape through every bush in the forest. Levry and Affam were troublemakers. Rowan interrupted her. They had lied to the priest countless times, about needing money for food, but they drank it all away, even after you all warned him about their trickery. He continued giving them money. His reason for doing so was that if one day they really needed the money, and they came to him, but he denied them, that he would never be able to live with himself. So if you know, Declara muttered, if you know this, why torture him, Lord Rowan? For a mistake he did not deliberately commit. I have always thought you were a greater man than this, why do, Ugurk? She stopped in mid-sentence, when the gore finally flowed down the body of the screaming priest, and what was below revealed itself. Asterisk 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 asterisk. On a quiet hill under the moonlight, a couple of wolves rummaged around a dead fire. There were remnants of a sumptuous meal around the fire, and the smell that was left was driving the wolves crazy. A dull rumbling sound began to echo around the hill, and the hackles of the wolves were raised as they bared their teeth and let out growls, as they warily peered around. The rumblings increased in intensity, and the sounds were calamitous. The wolves yelped in panic, and began to flee. Suddenly reality seemed to twist, and the wolves paused mid-flight. In fact, everything around the hill was still. And like a mirror, the space began to develop cracks, and it shattered as a red glow tore through the air. After it passed, a rain of blood followed behind. 2 seconds later, 2 bursts of black light followed. The flood of blood that fell from the sky landed on the ground like meteors. Each drop that touched the ground sizzled and brought forth an awful stench. In a brief moment, the ground, trees, rocks, and animals touched by the blood melted into a bloody pus. The trail of devastation of the raining blood extended for as far as the eyes could see. The ground groaned and shook, and the earth rearranged itself, as if the pain from the blood touching it was too much to bear. The speed of the red glow was beginning to falter, and General Augustus Tiberius' figure was revealed inside. His face was very pale and every now and then he vomited a huge amount of blood. Suddenly, one of the chasing black lights accelerated in a zigzag motion and appeared at the front of the general. The 2 glows clashed. There was first silence, and then a bright light like the dawn of the sun, and then a shockwave that tore the skies apart. The circular wave of force reached the second black light, who conjured a dark scythe and tore through the wave and rushed towards the location of the clash, and impacted the glowing sun again. Another wave of force erupted from the impact. This time it reached the ground and the surroundings for miles across were destroyed. A small mining town that contained 30,000 people with 2 legendary dominators that acted as overseers were all wiped out instantly. A cry filled with anger and despair resounded, and a pitiful figure missing an arm with a frightening hole in his chest flew out. It was the general. He touched his waist and drew out a long wand. He waved it, and it ignited, bringing forth green lightning. The lightning wrapped around him and flung him north. The sky brightened from the flash of green lightning, and he disappeared far into the horizon. The black glow stopped and two figures appeared. The third prince and the hooded figure who was holding a black scythe. The hooded figure growled, "That was sloppy of you. I warned you not to underestimate him." The third prince was in front of the hooded figure, his eyes tracing the last of the disappearing green lightning. He turned his head to the figure behind him and smiled, his teeth flashed white, and he said, "Did I?" He fully turned his body to face him and held out his right hand, which held a beating heart. The heart appeared very strange because it was almost transparent. The pericardium was almost like a thin mesh you could see through. The arteries and veins were all visible, and you could clearly catch a glimpse of all the operations of the heart. "I got myself a present." His smiling expression suddenly changed, and he became razor-focused. He closed his eyes and muttered in Thul for a while. "His heart is strong. It can sustain more than 5 jumps." The hooded figure gestured impatiently. "Then let's get to the hunt. There is a limit to which I can keep the eyes of fate closed. We all underestimated Augustus. Clearly has an artifact close to the origin grade. Yet he did not activate it during the fight." The third prince mused as ribbons of black light streamed from his fingertips and began etching mystical runes in the air. "That is worrying. The child is more crafty than I gave him credit for." The hooded figure stroked his chin. "What a waste." The runes the third prince was setting up were completed, and it shimmered before it faded slowly. The surrounding immediately darkened, and an ephemeral weight settled in the air. From a mysterious angle, a wooden door emerged in the sky. It was gray and had an open palm bone as the door handle. In the center of the door was carved the grinning face of a child. The child's eyes were opened, and within it burned the light of nothingness. Chaotic flashes of light and darkness burned inside the eyes, and various scenery appeared within. The third prince took the still beating heart and presented it to the face. The child looked at the heart, then it nodded, the motion drawing loud creaks from the door. As if held together by glue, the child struggled to open his mouth, and with a snapping sound like wood breaking, it opened its maws. The prince unceremoniously stuffed the beating heart inside. The mouth closed and it began to chew. As it did, the colors of the door began to change, starting from the face. In a short while, the door was now red. A word appeared in Thul above the door. 3. Less than I expected. The third prince lampooned. It is still more than enough, that is, if you don't play with your food. Got it. This hunt tires me. I prefer easier pickings. The third prince grasped the palm bone and pushed the door open and showed a new place. The scenery that presented itself was different. It was of a jungle that was on fire. The desiccated corpses of countless animals were scattered everywhere. At the center of the jungle was a single fallen animal. It was a silver tiger, more than 40 feet long. Its growls were weak, and its tail slapped at the ground as its struggles reduced. A figure of a bloody man was latched at the throat of the silver tiger. As if the man felt something, it turned and saw a door in the air. 2 figures stepped through the door. A chubby man and a skinny hooded figure. The former waved at him. "Hi, there." Chapter 74 Dawn of Battle 5. What lay under the skin of the priest was something that resembled an insect. It had sleek black chitin that resembled plate armor, and apart from the 2 black arms that strangely had 6 fingers with wicked long claws, there were also 2 insect-like limbs folded at the chest. He also noticed a series of openings by the side of the creature like the gills from a fish, and it opened and closed in the likeness of breathing. They expelled a sort of fog that felt very dense as they fell to the ground without dispersal into the air, and in a short while, it was hard to see their legs beyond the knee. Creatures like this must be the source of the fog, Rowan thought, though judging by the amount this one produces, it would take tens of thousands of such creatures to produce the overwhelming amount of fog outside the manor that nearly reached the clouds. Or maybe there was another way of producing the fog, that requires less of such creatures to produce it. He clearly hoped it was the second option, not because they were a danger to him, but protecting his people would be far harder otherwise. Yet, since these creatures appear to be the source of the flying eyes, that would mean that anywhere there was deep fog, he may find them. Strangely, the priest he held aloft kept weeping and crying out for his forgiveness. He seemed to be disconnected from what was underneath his skin. Rowan had grown more perceptive as his spirit increased, and he had a frightening notion that maybe the priest did not understand what he was under his skin. The terrible guilt that Perdue felt made him accept that it was the right thing for Rowan to torture him, and what he only implored was for him to say the prayers for the departed souls. Indeed, except for the gut-twisting pain he must have felt when Rowan tore his skin away from him, there was nothing else to indicate that he understood what he was underneath. Almost as if he were two separate individuals occupying the same body. The whole room went silent, except for the weepings of the priest. Everyone was dumbstruck. Is he like one of them? A nervous man said, the sword in his hand shaking. Was he taken over by the abominations? All of you, step outside. Rowan said. Not you, Captain, you and your men should stay behind. The captain seemed to be deep in thought for a moment, before he settled and gestured for his men to stand beside him. Rowan was still holding the priest up, and he gently shook the crying man. Look at yourself, priest. His words were like a command, and the distraught man seemed to be forced against his will, as he bent down and looked at himself. The action he took was a cruel thing. It was mostly to confirm if truly the priest was not aware of what had taken his body. Many expressions passed through the face of the priest, from perplexity, to incredulity, then anger and finally fear. Then he began to scream, and he soon broke into prayer. Holy Dark One, free my flesh from this defilement. I, your son, come to you, seeking your favor and mercies, as my flesh has been desecrated, and this was the extent to which he could pray. Before he broke down into sobs, he looked at Rowan confused and looked back at himself, at the alien creature beneath his skin, and his eyes slowly took the alacrity of acceptance. I once had a dream, you know, about the end of my days, and although I had this dream as a boy, I have never forgotten a single part of it. Tell me, Rowan said to the priest. I saw myself in a fall that never ended. It was as if I was thrown from the highest mountain, and as I fell, the anticipation of the end kept building without ceasing, yet I never reached the ground, and even though the fall seemed endless, the fear of my body touching the ground never decreases, until it became everything I was, fear. It was a dream that seemed to last forever and instantly. The priest looked at Rowan. My lord, I never knew of this thing below my skin. I would not betray all I stood for, just to become a thrall of an abomination. Rowan nodded. I believe your words, Perdue. Please know that I deeply apologize for thinking that you allowed yourself to become a thrall of an abomination. Forgive my lack of faith in your strength. The priest burst out in pained laughter. Believe me, my lord, it was nothing about my strength or will. I was just too weak to know or understand that I had been taken over. I do not believe so. Nothing says more about your strength for an enemy to attack you with deception. We do not have much time, and I hope you can help me. Tell me anything you know, no matter how small or how insignificant you might think they is. I don't think I have anything to tell you, but maybe this might be important. I began having a reoccurring dream a few years back. I saw myself going to a secret passage underneath my church, and inside that place were thousands of people who were being killed as they slept. Rowan noticed that the two folded limbs in front of the priest began to twitch. They seemed as if they wanted to silence the priest, but their motion was weak. Ignoring it for the moment, he nodded to the priest, encouraging him to continue. I see myself, also underground, where there were endless passages, that goes ever deeper into the earth, until I fear they would reach Moloch halls. Throughout this speech, the movements of the body underneath the priest's skin had increased in its intensity, and he was beginning to bleed from all the orifices of his face. My lord, if these are not dreams but the memories of this thing inside me, I fear that underneath our feet are countless souls being tortured and killed, not only for the purpose of creating abominations, but for something more sinister. The voice of the priest cracked, and he sounded more like a haunted old man. No more blood could escape from his head anymore, and his face began to tear open, exposing sections of bloody bones beneath. My lord, those people will die, Rowan said to him, all of them. But first, you should perform the rites for the fallen, as it is your duty. My lord, I am unclean. I am no longer worthy of that right. Shish. In my eyes, there is no one more deserving of this right than you. Rowan knew gods traditionally served as figures that bestowed forgiveness to people. He had the bloodline of Empyrean, making his potential far higher than any god. Although he did not know if he was worthy to absolve the sins of a tortured man, but as it is in many things in life, it was the appearance of power, rather than true power itself, that held sway. Rowan spoke to the dying man in a loud voice, and he let his presence as an Empyrean come through him. The eyes of the priest were shocked awake as Rowan gently dropped him on the ground, holding his head up, so the rest of him was hidden by the fog. Chapter 75 Dawn of Battle Final. Behind him, the captain and his guardsmen fell to their knees, except for the captain, who could barely stay on his knees. The remaining guardsmen faces were pressed to the ground, their faces all held in horror. Perdu Milinuus, priest of the dark god Malekith. Would you accept my words of absolution? I would, my lord, but how do you know my last name? I only ever told. Mersha. Rowan smiled at him. Does it matter? Know this, proud priest of the Dark One. I have seen your deeds and I do not find it wanting. You have conducted yourselves in a noble manner, beyond reproach, and even under the shackles of evil, your heart was not laid astray. Whatever misdeeds the enemy has done using your flesh as a guise shall not be counted as your burden to bear. The priest seemed to breathe easier. Thank you, my lord, for giving me peace. Every night, my soul burns. It hurts. No more. Forgive me for not having the strength to perform the last rites for the fallen, but, I believe, your presence was more than enough to give them rest. The priest smiled at him, and breathed his last. Rowan gently lay him down, and the fog covered his body. Rowan bowed his head in grief. He had made a mistake again. He had assumed that everyone responsible must have full knowledge of what they were into, or at least they were like henchmen, only here for a profit. But something far more diabolical was going on, for the participants in this scheme may not even know that they were part of it. He remembered the drawing he had of Maeve, and he shuddered. Rowan felt like a fool. Once again reminded that there was always more that met the eyes, when he played on the same field as a dominator. High on the powers the legendary state of his bloodline had granted him, he became quite rash, although a large part of him knew there was no other option before him. He had made the right decisions, it was his methods that felt wrong. The priest was simply a shell, his blood, flesh, and bones had been consumed, he was simply a puppet held by strings of an invisible puppeteer, yet he still felt guilt for the way he had approached the situation, although he knew it was quite illogical, he did not dismiss this feeling inside his heart. Because that was what made him human, and it was an easy thing to forget. Even in his rage, he had to learn to direct his anger, or he was nothing less than an animal. If he were to kill, it must be clean and precise. He did not have the power to free the priest of such a deep level of corruption. Nonetheless, the methods he used could have been more humane. He had been too quick to condemn. It would be a different case if he was the weaker party here, but he was stronger, and he had exercised his powers without hesitation, and he had been cruel. That troubled him deeply. Waking up in a world where life was treated like dirt, it would be the easiest thing to change to such a mindset. He could butcher hordes of enemies without a backward glance because it was effortless, and it felt wonderful. To destroy all those that did you harm, to slaughter until you were bathed in blood, to know he was paying back in the same coin as he was dealt, must feel really good, yet Rowan knew he had to draw a line. He had no doubt he was going to kill. What he had within him was too valuable, his bloodlines, the primordial record, any of it would cause a calamity that would drag even the gods from their thrones to fight over his flesh. He had within him a potential for endless power, and his power would draw enemies, more than a stinking corpse drew maggots. Nevertheless, he did not have the habit of submitting to fate, or laying down and taking countless abuses, and so he was going to fight, and yes, he was going to kill, and perhaps the number of people he might end up killing would end up to be greater than every piece of sand on an endless beach, but he would never glory in mindless torture. He was taking a life. Even in his rage, he should respect that. He would be a killer, but never a monster. The difference between both was a very fine line, but he suspected that if he did not keep an awareness of that line in his heart, he would be capable of far more terrible deeds than what was happening here. It might seem as if he were overreacting, but his abilities made it straightforward for him to abuse it for evil. This world is an abyss. He was not just gazing into it, he was inside of it, and the only thing holding him back from being one with the abyss was the warmth inside his soul, the people who have up their flames of life so that he should live. For their sake, he would do better, he would be better, for he would not let this abyss take him. Although his head was bowed, his sight still covered the entire room, and he captured everything happening inside of it. He could clearly see the apparently dead priest whose eyes now shone with a glow of new intelligence, slowly rising from the ground, the two sets of arms he had, making him resemble a giant cockroach. He could also see the captain and his guardsmen also silently pulling out their swords. Were they going to attack him, or this creature? Yet, Rowan's attention was not really on them. He had sent his snakes to scrub through the entire manor. Now that he knew the methods for detecting the hidden wolves among the sheep, he decided to strike while the iron was hot. Two of the snakes descended to the basement below where most of the survivors and staff were. Rowan discovered they had sharper senses than him when it came to the aspects of energy. They had discovered an excessive amount of energy inside the priest, that even his aura could not cloak the excessive energy from their sights. They were to search through everyone inside the manor, and detect the outliers. When they did, he gave only a single command: eat. It would be quick and painless, for these people, taken without their wills, do not deserve his wrath. Of course, he sent the one and two-eyed snakes, for their temperament was suitable for such delicate work. The last snake, Three Eyes, he really should give them names, was the far more energetic one. His quest was to search for Maeve. A cursory search from him did not reveal her presence. It was also to eat every single flying eye it saw. Though he reduced its search radius to within the grounds of the manor, forbidden it from entering the fog. Even though he suspected that without killing him, his snakes were virtually immortal, they tended to draw a lot of energy from him when they resurrected. He needed to be at his peak state to avoid a state of weakness at a critical time. They were already drawing a lot of energy from him, and this was them at their base forms. He had not even started upgrading the legendary state level of Ouroboros. When he did, he expected that the expenditure would increase drastically anytime they resurrected. Feeling the smelly breath wafting in his face, he turned most of his concentration to the creature in front of him. It was wearing a grin, making the mouth of the priest stretch unnaturally wide, its eyes blazing yellow. "Greetings, O fallen prince," the creature said to him. "To whom do I speak?" Rowan said. "Your death," it replied, and Rowan smiled. Chapter 76 Battle Without End. The yellow eyes of the dead priest began to glow more brightly, and Rowan felt his head begin to throb, and he flinched backward a little as if he were bitten by an insect. Clearly expecting a more severe reaction than this, the priest snarled, and his eyes glowed brighter, and the irritating headache he felt increased. Rowan frowned, and slapped the creature. Even though he reduced his strength as much as possible, he still broke his jaws, and one of its eyes exploded. "What are you?" This creature was clearly focused towards the spirit attribute, and lacked a strong physique. The ability it used on him was something that affected his spirit, like a spiritual attack ability, and even though his spirit was the least of his attributes, it was still extremely strong, and he was just realizing that his physique could passively repel malicious energies to an extent, including mental attack. Even though an Empyrean was weak in the spirit attributes, it did not mean they did not have a proper defense against it. They were naturally resistant due to their insane regeneration and tyrannical physique. The creature began picking itself from the ground, the fear in its eyes was clear. Rowan saw its single eye shifting around. Did it want to escape? Rowan found it interesting that the thralls of Abomination, despite their intelligence, were ultimately weaker because of that trait. A normal abomination would keep attacking until it was torn to pieces. Their sheer savagery could tip the scales in their favor, where skills and intelligence could not. "So you have self-awareness," Rowan said as he walked closer to the retreating figure. He lifted his axe, and pointed it at the abomination. "You are a thrall of the abomination in the lake, aren't you?" The creature began to laugh. As the dislocated jaw quivered with the motion, the mouth of the priest was open in a leer due to the broken jaw. Although the sound of laughter was coming from the priest's mouth, it was not moving. The creature had finally stopped the charade of using the body of the priest. "I am not a lowly thrall, fallen prince, and I would advise you to stop destroying the winged eyes, or you would find the consequences of that action difficult to bear." "It's good you don't want me to destroy them," Rowan said. "That means that is what I should focus on." "You are a child," the creature snickered, "who plays with powers you can never understand. Great minds have put together powerful workings that would shift the very foundation of this world. You are too irrelevant to hamper this event. So stop your shenanigans and die in peace, knowing you were part of something greater than you would ever know." At the end of the rant, the creature was beginning to scream. Rowan realized he was not just dealing with something evil, but a fanatic, which in his mind was far worse. If he was expecting proper reasoning from this creature, it was now a moot point, for nothing was stronger than a conviction that is believed in its totality. There would be no room for arguments or finding a common ground. Every sentient creature was born a blank canvas. They were a repository of ideas and dreams just waiting to be filled up. This was the greatest magic of intelligence, but also its greatest deficiencies. In a perfect world, a budding child should be guided with firm hands, taught the difference between good and evil, but also provided the opportunity to understand what both signify and also the freedom to choose their path. It was a shame in all the universes that there was no perfect world. Knowledge was not given freely, but instead a biased set of rules were indoctrinated, and the greatest gift of sentience was warped, and their ability to reason was stunted. All for a single purpose. For the benefit of the powerful. Control was their currency. Rowan knew that trying to learn from this creature was a waste of time. he would kill it, and every other thing in his path, and leave this place. Rowan raised the axe, and flaming chains shot from the ground and wrapped around his wrist. I can't allow you to do that, Lord Rowan. The supervisor is one of the keys used in controlling the abomination outside. Captain, so you are one of these things too. Captain Titus grimaced, as disgust flashed through his face. I serve the interest of your father, Lord Rowan, and I believe if he sees how powerful you have become, he would allow you to live. Allow me, Captain. You cannot win this fight, my lord. It would be the wiser option to leave your fate in the hands of your father. I believe that if he sees you now, he would never allow you to die. I wish I could believe you, Captain. Rowan shrugged and the chains around his wrist shattered to pieces. The captain fell to his knees as he vomited blood. Clearly this flaming chain should be his legendary ability. I am not in the habit of dancing to the tunes of those who wish to control my mind. Rowan swung the axe. The creature attempted to flee, but it was too late. The axe sliced through its waist, cutting it in two. Rowan was careful not to rip out his soul, as he felt a new sensation as he had cut through this creature. He had touched its soul. It was something of damp and rot, and when his axe had cleaved through its spine, he nearly saw an image, but it was gone faster than he could process what he saw. Soul Caesar had never given him the sensation of touching a soul before. Perhaps it was the upgrade to Soul Reaver. Rowan wanted to collect the soul of this creature, but similar to an abomination, it was broken and disjointed. He bent down and hauled it up by its neck, and raised his axe. Stop him! The captain screamed. Rowan frowned. The battle cry of the captain and the remaining guardsmen pulled his attention. They all held their swords and charged at him. The captain was at the forefront. Rowan received his charge by blocking his blade and slapping him away with the flat side of his axe, in a single motion. The sword in his hand bent to a C shape, and the axe slammed into his chest. The captain's leg dug 2 furrows in the ground. The armor covering his chest caved inward, and he vomited blood and internal tissues. He would have fallen if he were not holding on to the walls. He was not as merciful to the remaining guardsmen. They held no important information, but they were fiercely loyal. They would only sabotage him if he left them alive. They attacked him from both directions. The first guardsman swung at him furiously, his sword leaving a silver flash in the air. Rowan replied with a single overhead blow, as if he was splitting a log. The axe blade sliced through the sword and into the head of the guardsman. The blow did not stop, and he was cut in half, armor and all. He stood still for a second, a red line bisecting his body from head to crotch. His eyes rolled in 2 different directions before he exploded into gory bits. The weight and power behind Rowan's swing, nearly vaporizing him. The second guardsman had leapt up, his sword pointing at Rowan. He yelled a valiant war cry as he drove the sword down. Rowan struck upward. He clashed with the sword, and it simply disintegrated. The axe blade barely paused before hitting the chest of the guardsman, reducing the upper part of his body to nothing but bloody stains in the air. His legs dropped to the ground strangely in a kneeling position. Chapter 77 Battle Without End 2. The 2 charging guardsmen were a feint, for they had brought enough time for the last guardsman to set up his crossbow. A flurry of red-tipped arrows flew at him. Rowan slapped the first away nonchalantly, and his eyes crinkled slightly before it exploded, barely pushing his hand back, but the damage was already done. The remaining arrow covered his body, but Rowan simply blocked them, by raising the creature in his right hand as a shield, but the explosion was unexpectedly massive. The exploding arrows seemed to undergo a chain reaction when many of them exploded at once, for they threw him backwards over the table into the sidewall, which soon became covered in flames and smoke, as the guardsman did not stop firing, until his quiver was empty. Rowan's soft sigh came from the flames, and a glimmer of gold and green shone through the flames, and the flames were blown away. The guardsman with the crossbow shattered into pieces of flesh and the wall behind him exploded, also followed by the wall behind. The axe rested on the rubble of the last wall, the air swirling around violently in its wake. That glint was Rowan throwing the axe, and the incredible momentum from the throw had put out the flames and killed the guardsman before destroying 3 walls. Rowan looked at the creature in his hand. It was barely alive. The explosion had torn what was left of the human shell it inhabited. Rowan's body, however, was still pristine, free from dust or smoke, for the damage the arrow inflicted on him was so minimal, that it could hardly penetrate the field his vitality had over his body. Rowan still had little knowledge about the capabilities of his legendary Empyrean body, as he was unaware of this passive field that was generated around him. It seemed linked to his constitution. Anything that could not break his defense would not be able to touch him. He looked at the dying creature he held. the remaining eye in its skull had been burned off and most of his skin had been burned to charcoal, the sounds it made were weak. No, no, do not die on me yet. Rowan slapped the face of the creature repeatedly, trying to force out the last spark of life from its stunned body. Using this method, he could barely touch its soul. He searched through the noxious darkness, to grab anything he could from its soul, and he finally saw a single static image. It was hundreds of hooded figures bowing before a throne made of webs and darkness. Rowan strained to see what lied inside that darkness, but was denied. His touch must have been the final straw, for the creature suddenly spasmed before it gave a long cry, Muther rrrrrrrr. Its head fell and it was no more. Rowan dropped the dead body. The soul that streamed into him was cold and broken. Like those of the abominations, the guardsmen he killed were also the same. The implications of these were very troubling. Rowan turned to the captain, who by now knelt on the floor. His crushed armor had bound him fast, and he could hardly move. His breath came in short and hard gasps. His face was pale, but still set in stubborn lines. You are making a mistake, Rowan. You are playing with forces that are far beyond your comprehension. He bent down and gave a rough cough, spitting out more internal organs. Is that so, Captain? Well, I'm all ears. Rowan began walking to him. Tell me the mistakes I am making. Rowan bent and drew the captain up, looking at the crushed part of his armor. Rowan fished around and held a bent section and began pulling the crushed armor away from his body. The sound the metal made as it was slowly bent and pulled out was irritating. Captain Titus was able to breathe properly again. He breathed deeply, disregarding the pain of his crushed chest and collapsed lungs. The captain gave a 1,000-mile stare to him. His hand surprisingly still held his bent sword. His words were spoken as if he was in the depth of dreams. Every action we have taken, no matter how bizarre or cruel, was for a greater purpose. We are going to save the world. We will bring it all back. Our glory. The pride of man shall rise again. We shall crush every infidel, every usurper, every traitor, and the glory of man shall light the ages past and present. Saliva poured out from the mouth of the captain. His eyes were lit up by a fanatical glow. They sought for understanding from the cold gaze of Rowan, who watched him silently. Don't you see, it's not too late to turn back. To return to the path laid down for you. We can forgive everything that has happened here and can rebuild everything you have destroyed. Go back to sleep and everything will be back to the way it was. Trust me, please, my prince. Your sacrifice would be edified for all the myriad races. Your name shall be praised until the end of the world. On your divine corpse we shall build an empire that will conquer all things. Rowan looked at the captain. With a strange gaze, he silently showed the captain the blood that had begun falling from his body. It was no longer red, but yellow. Tell me, Captain, you said you served my father, and a glorious empire, then what are you now? The captain looked at his blood confused. There was a moment where panic entered his eyes and he looked at Rowan. We have been betrayed. His eyes were beginning to turn yellow, but he shook his head. Clearly his willpower was strong. You have to inform your father that he has been betrayed. The nexus is no longer his, but. He seemed to have lost his train of thought, and his eyes began to glaze over. Rowan shook him. How do I reach my father? Talk to me, Captain, or your glorious vision is relinquished. Below. Processing facility. Sigils must have weakened, for we have all been corrupted. Leave this place. Please run. We cannot allow them to have it. The order. Roars began to enter Rowan's perception, as his three-eyed snake showed him, tens of thousands of abominations charging towards the manor. Giant form abominations in their hundreds and dozens of flying abominations were stirring the fog with massive wings. If they reached the manor, it would be overrun instantly and everyone here would die. Rowan's face changed. He must have alerted whomever must be in charge, and they were trying to stop him. Rowan looked at the captain, who was shaking and delirious, as his eyes were slowly turning yellow. He did not see his father as someone who would willingly give his subordinates to others. Clearly things were not going smoothly among the co-conspirators. This could work in his favor, if there was disunity among the heads. He looked at the captain who had slipped into a form of coma, and as Rowan's spirit penetrated his flesh, he saw a similar creature like what was inside the priest, beginning to grow inside him. Rowan gripped his neck, and twisted, severing the spine. The captain's head flopped onto his chest and he let him fall. The growth of that creature was halted. The howls of the incoming abomination had reached the manor, and the shaking ground felt like countless mini-earthquakes happening simultaneously. Since the charade was falling off, Rowan commanded his serpents to return. He was going to cut the strings bounding him. His sight swept through the approaching army as he wondered if they were enough to push him to the rift state. Chapter 78 Battle Without End 3. The commotion from the short battle had reached the people standing outside, and the destruction of the walls had allowed them to see the final part of what transpired. They may not have understood what happened, but seeing the insect-like creature inside the priest and the ravings of the captain was enough to frighten them. He looked at the shaken people, a hint of pity in his eyes, but battle was upon them, and he could not risk their lives in what was coming. The army charging towards them was a testament to the ridiculous number of people who had been killed in whatever horrifying experiment was happening here. Rowan was glad that out of everyone inside the manor, only 3 people had been corrupted by those insects-like creatures, who Rowan feared were not abominations themselves, but something else. He now had several clues he could pursue. The first was that there was apparently a giant facility underground that was responsible for processing abominations en masse. Rowan knew the attacks of the abomination were not natural, everything pointed against it, for it would be impossible for an infestation of this size to grow to this level without outside interference. The second most important clue was a term, the Nexus. This name was not strange to him. In fact, every alchemist worth his salt would know this term. A nexus was a self-contained bio-containment unit, used to grow and experiment on diverse specimens. Isolated. The poisons Rowan used for his first sojourn into that world with the red moon were cultured in a nexus. But, operating a nexus was a ridiculously expensive affair, and he had never heard of any unit being greater than the size of a small house, but this was Calcutta, an entire town. Although its population was small, it did not mean it was a small town in terms of size. Apparently he was one of the specimens under study here. The Abomination Core was still one of their subjects, and those insect-like supervisors were controlling its spawn using this fog. In a manner, Rowan could understand why the Abomination Core was placed here inside the Nexus with him. They ranked as one of the most dangerous creatures on the planet, because of their capacity for endless evolutions. Given enough material, an abomination could evolve to reach the peak of existence in any given biodome they found themselves in. That meant given enough time and resources, in a world like Tryon, an abomination could spawn gods. It was a scary notion, and it was the reason they were ruthlessly crushed in their infancy, for their growth meant the decimation of all life around them. He also had the capacity for endless evolution and growth, and unlike the abomination he fed on something more ephemeral, which was souls. Unlike the Abomination Core who had been hopelessly controlled, he felt the noose around his neck was looser because they had no idea how he was getting stronger, and so, a mistake was made on his rate of growth. Else there would be no way they would respond to his apparent new abilities by sending an army of abominations to stop him. They were just fueling his growth. Not that it would matter if he could not escape the Nexus. The highest state of change Rowan knew of was the incarnation state. No doubt there were many more states of change above that, and he had no doubt that his father would be in a far higher state than himself, and although he was an Empyrean, it did not mean he could not be crushed like a bug. But he did not need to challenge him for now, for that would certainly be very foolish. What he needed to do was escape. The facility underground must certainly exist because it would require an insane amount of energy and organization to properly manage a nexus of this size. And he could not see any sort of facility above ground that would serve as a control hub. The approaching abominations beckoned his consciousness, and Rowan began splitting his mind. Although it may appear that he had lots of time, that was only referring to his lifespan. His time of freedom inside this nexus was running out. He may have an hour, or a day to make his move, but he had a glimmer of hope because he knew he was inside a nexus, and he had an idea how most work, regardless of its size. He finally saw a light of hope through the darkness because someone slipped up, and he understood where he was. His upgrade to the legendary state would give him the power to seize that opportunity. Time seemed to slow down, as the cold flames of his agility attributes ran through his frame. He separated his consciousness into multiple parts. One of them took a portion of his spatial sight and zoomed underground, searching for the underground facility, for the control hub would undoubtedly be there. The control hub would usually have a powerful guardian to restrict the specimens from escaping using one of the few points of egress in the nexus. That tied to his second goal, exterminating every single abomination inside the nexus, and using the souls to power up for as much as possible. He did not know if it would be able to push him to the rift state, but he was willing to try. He would need every advantage he had to fight the guardian of this gigantic nexus. Anything put in place to stop an abomination core in case of any mishaps would be mighty. Killing it would be a challenge, but if he could, he would leave this place, and he could finally disappear into the crowd. The third was the strings that tied the primordial record. He split his sight to travel down the strings, and discovered that one of them led underground, and the other two disappeared far into the sky. Following the path of the one that led underground, his sight was blocked by a metallic barrier, and he paused. He had reached the control hub. The last of his consciousness addressed the frightened people before him. He did not give them time to think, only orders. Genmir, Kriya, Swerma, you are the fastest men here. There is a key to my alchemy laboratory above inside my room. At the workstation, check the fourth drawer. Inside my lab, there are a series of blue vials on the shelves to your right. Carefully pack them and bring them to the cellar. Be careful, for they are quite delicate, and your survival would depend on them. He turned to the rest. Gather every available resources inside the manor, and bring them down to the cellar. I would be sealing the doors with sigils. You have 5 minutes. Hurry. About to leave, he saw the fear and concern in their eyes, and Declara was the boldest among them. She gestured for the rest to leave and took a single step towards Rowan and said, My lord, what about you? She looked around her as a hanging frame fell and shattered on the floor. The manor was vibrating with the incoming steps of the abomination. I am going to stop what is coming, before any of you gets hurt. He nodded towards the approaching sound. Seeing more queries and concern on her face, he sighed, and flared his powers for a brief instant, and she went white. Do as your lord commands, I will be enough. Nodding mutely, she followed the rest. Rowan looked at her for a few moments. He had heard her whispers as she wished for his safety. In a manner, she reminded him of his mother. He shook his head before turning away, and disregarding the passage he would take to go outside, he simply broke through the stone walls. They felt as if he was walking through cardboard. Chapter 79 Battle Without End 4. Walking past the axe, he gripped the handle, and he made the snakes appear around him. They had succeeded in the task he gave them, and except for Maeve that he could not find, they had killed all the so-called supervisors inside the manor. He came outside. His 7-foot frame was intimidating, coupled with his grace of movement. He appeared in control of everything. His jacket gently flapped in the wind, and he tightened his hold on his axe. This time he was stepping out into the world, and he was not inside his shell, a small frightened child who was confused, with no meaningful direction, who had but a few moments to live. He was still confused, but he was no longer frightened. That was growth, right? The one-eyed snake, flying beside him, spat out a metallic plate and Rowan took it. It was a sigil plate. He had a suspicion that he had to verify, as the first time he saw the strings, they had reminded him of something. The first time he saw a sigil plate, his spirit and spatial sight were far weaker than they are now, but he was able to verify some patterns that he had memorized. Focusing his sight on the sigil plate, he began to zoom into it. The metallic plate served as a sort of barrier to his probe, but not for long as he soon entered inside it. His spatial sight passed through a layer of darkness, and he saw strings. Unlike the strings bounding the pages of the primordial record, this one was far simpler, and although he could not trace every single line used, B was able to figure out certain patterns. Also, unlike the screams he heard when he looked at the former, the sensation he received from these strings were muted, almost as if it were non-human. Pulling his sight away, he finally figured out what had bound the record. It was sigils. He sent the snake to return it to the door of the cellar, as the army had crossed a greater part of the way. He could now really appreciate the magnitude of what was arrayed before him. It would be hard to describe the sight of 10,000 marching men, talk less of an army of monsters of these proportions. They were like an army of darkness, as their movement tore the earth to pieces, and the presence of so many abominations twisted reality. He saw that the clouds over this army appeared faded, as if the abominations were draining the life of everything around it. Rowan touched his chest. The familiar beating of his heart was gone, only a black void remained. Apart from the human sensibilities he had in his last life, he was truly no longer a man. No man would see such an array of monsters charging at him, and feel nothing but calm. Was it not amazing that it was the little things that really affected his mental state? It was not the prospect of him being able to control tens of thousands of planets in the future that influenced him. After all, it was still a distant goal. His missing heart struck him deeply. The blood flowing in his veins could well be liquid metal. They were heavy, and its flow was steady. No fear. There would be a time when he needed his human emotions to guide his decision, but not now. His golden eyes began to glow, as lightning seemed to be flashing inside of it. Holding the axe with both hands, he began running towards the fight. His snakes were still in small shapes, about 10 feet long, resembling pythons. His first step made the ground explode. The sound was like a bomb blast. Rowan's figure turned to a blur. as his second step was made at the boundary of his manor, nearly 100 meters away from his first step. He angled his feet, so he did not just go forward but upward. The force of the second step made a massive crater, as his body was launched into the air. His snakes roared as they expanded, and he landed on the head of the two-eyed snake, who pushed the others aside, so it could be the one to receive him. Rowan chuckled, and with a mental command, his giant 70-foot-long Ouroboros serpents began to ascend to the skies. Their ascent was both graceful and still equally terrifying to watch, for their appearance in their full form seemed to strain the very atmosphere they flew through. This was the first time an Empyrean had walked the skies of this world. Rowan had enough mental capacity to appreciate the first time he sort of flew through the skies. He dispelled that thought, however. He did not want his memory of this event to be tainted by battle and bloodshed. The air around his hand began to pulsate. As he began gathering his vitality, the axe in his hands began to hum, as it was the first time he was giving it his vitality. As soon as he broke into the legendary state, there seemed to be a barrier holding back the amount of essence he could give the axe. Then he understood that it was not a barrier, but that the axe could not handle the amount of essence that he was giving it. The axe began to glow red, as the green parts left on the axe head and the shaft seemed to burn. Above him, 7 gigantic phantasmal axes, nearly 20 meters across, winked to life, and they seemed to be burning with flames. Rowan looked down at the charging army, and with a roar, he let loose. The air exploded with a shriek, as the 7 axes descended like burning meteorites, slicing in half an unlucky avian abomination, and quicker than the eyes could follow, they reached the ground and exploded, flinging dead and wailing abominations hundreds of feet into the air. His vitality was endless, and he unleashed the technique, again and again. The savagery of the snakes beside him was ignited. The one-eyed went for the flying abominations, while the three-eyed descended to the army below. The three-eyed Ouroboros serpent was fast, and when it reached the ground it did not stop. It slammed into the earth, tearing apart dozens of abominations, and drilled underground, only to emerge underneath the giant, where its first bite severed the giant at the waist, and it curled around the broken giant, and the next bite was at the head, slicing through it like a hot knife through butter, and it promptly swallowed down the head, disregarding the rest of the corpse. Its cold 3 eyes surveyed the battlefield as if it were a dining hall. It shrieked and, like a high-speed train, it began to move. It stayed a few feet off the ground, but its speed was churning the earth as it moved past. It started going after the giants, and every single abomination in its path was turned to mush. The motion from its tail slapped the air like thunder cracks, and any abomination within 100 feet of that snapping tail was turned to a yellow stain in the air. By now, the one-eyed snake had finished consuming close to half of the avian abomination in the air, and there were barely 20 left. The Ouroboros snake moved through the air with unearthly grace and power. The avian abomination covered it, and they tried to bite through its flesh. They all failed, and with a shake of its body, they were pulverized. Rowan grinned at the sight. This part of him, this utterly inhuman part, was glorying in this battle. His golden air fluttered with the wind generated by the massive Ouroboros snake below him, as massive streams of soul power poured into him. No, this was not battle, this was slaughter. Not realizing when he began to laugh, Rowan continued releasing phantasmal axes into the pandemonium that was the battlefield below, as that stretch of land turned into hell. Chapter 80, Bonus Chapter, Battle Without End, Final. General Augustus Tiberius had 10 seconds to live. He roared and channeled the inexhaustible ether granted by his incarnations. He burned the roots of his bloodline down to his marrow, as his flesh wilted into a dry husk, but the Tiberius family controlled blood, and he was refilled instantly. Augustus gathered everything into a blood orb the size of a pinhead, and he made it explode at the 2 reaching hands that had been tearing into him for the past 3 hours. Space collapsed and chaos emerged. Everything instantly was destroyed. His body quaked and shattered into pieces multiple times, and his third incarnation went lackluster. He was down to his last, but he knew it would not be enough. The tool he thought would be the source of his protection became the source of his impending demise. His mind returned to a faithful night, 55 years ago, when he received a cryptic message from an organization called the Order of the Broken Eye. They came to him when he had just returned from the front lines in the northern continent. The last battle there had been rough, and he knew he could not take much of this fight before he would inevitably fall. The losses in the last fight had been catastrophic. He had nearly died a true death multiple times, but that was not what bothered him. He was a child from the bloodline of Tiberius, the god of war. Likewise, he did not expect he would die in his bed of old age. No, He expects to die screaming in his own torn-out guts, with endless miles of devastation around him, yet he wanted his death to have meaning. Tiberius, unlike the other gods, did not value potential all that much. What he gave importance to was power. Augustus had the potential to become one of the strongest weapons in the hands of Tiberius, but that would take a long time, and he was not particularly unique in that aspect, as he knew of a dozen dominators with his potential. The war god was not a patient one, he would not wait for him to bloom. What he craved was endless battle, and he saw no difference between the fight between two mortals or two dominators. In his lofty position, they were all the same. What he craved was the endless song of blades, the torrential downpour of blood that would flood the world. What the war god craved was a battle without end. In the endless rat race of a dominator's life, as they strived for powers under the gaze of unforgiven gods, Augustus knew he would not make it. Somewhere in that unavoidable next battles he would fight, he was going to perish there. His death would be meaningless, just one of the countless statistics that was war. His life and story would be buried below an ocean of blood and bodies, and the name Augustus Tiberius would be nothing but a footnote, under a pile of footnotes a mountain tall. How could he accept this? He had broken past the first great cycle and was on the threshold of the second. He had tasted power and longevity. Why would he let all that slip from his grasp? The gods were eternal and merciless, and no matter how much the pitiful dominators struggled under them, hoping for recognition and care, it was nothing but a fever dream. Placing your hopes in the gods is building a castle on a foundation of loose sand. A few decades ago, Augustus would have killed anyone who made such a blasphemous statement, but now he just gazed at these two figures before him with apathy. Surely, there must be a good reason why you would speak such words to me. Augustus snarled. A member of the Justice Council is somewhere behind that mountain. I scream a little loud, and your heads would lie at my feet in a moment. Oh, but we know you would not do anything, Augustus. After all, how many people would spurn the chance to transcend the tyranny of the shackles placed on them by the very gods they serve? The third prince smiled. You speak of a fairy tale. It is impossible to escape the pathways of power, Augustus whispered and turned away, his eyes peering far into the horizon. Did anyone tell you that your eyes are beautiful? The third prince said. Augustus smirked, and looked at the hooded figure, who was sighing in exasperation. The hooded man cleared his throat, and said, Forgive the thoughtless words of my partner, you get used to his antics after a while. Listen to our fairy tale, and be the judge of the truth. Augustus Tiberius listened. At first, he was not too invested in their tale, that quickly changed. When he heard more, his fingers went white, and his eyes widened in surprise and dread. He had not felt true terror in a long time, and he felt it now. If the stories were true, and with the mounds of evidence this hooded figure had shown him, he could escape this rat race of endless battles. After what seemed like an eternity, Augustus licked his dry lips and said, If I agree to enter into this venture, then this partnership cannot be maintained by trust alone, the benefits are too massive. As is expected, that is the second reason we came to you, of all we could have selected for this partnership. The hooded figure said, I trust you know the ritual for the thorn of blood. Augustus paused and nodded agreement. He awoke the ability to enhance agreement when he broke past the first great circle, if he used it on a binding ritual such as the thorn of blood, a technique that could also be enhanced by his bloodline, then it would take a god to break it. He had trusted them because of that, not suspecting that they would have a god behind them, for he did not believe a god would ever support any venture to break their control over the bloodlines of Dominator. Well, he was mistaken, and he would die for his oversights. He was fighting two battles. The thorn of blood was hampering his abilities. Every move he made against the two of them would tear his hearts to pieces and reduce the might of his techniques. His two attackers were not affected by the thorn of blood. In fact, their powers were enhanced against him, as the thorn of blood believed he was the one breaking the pact. The very fact that he was being killed by the very workings he cast nearly drove him insane from anger. He had 8 seconds to live. In 1,000 years, he might be able to reach beyond the second great circle and begin to touch the realm of the gods themselves. General Augustus knew that far-off hope was gone, and with rage in his cry and despair in his heart, he stripped away the essence of his incarnations. He drew forth the power of Tiberius from his core, pushing past every restraint his bloodline had over his flesh, down to the very root of his being, and for a brief moment, he touched the next great circle, and he would have wept if he were able to. He had finally seen the instrument of his desires, had briefly touched it, but he will never experience it ever again. The world went still, and even chaos itself went mad from seeing the essence of Tiberius. There was no way he could control this power. He did not attempt to do so. he only gave a single command: destroy. Existence for a brief moment ceased. Everything was stained red, down to the atoms, a consuming force of endless hunger swept through the endless chaos. It is said at its end when an incarnation falls, it would burn brighter than every star that ever graced the skies.